The cops called her a runaway. The clock says she's running out of time. Mr. Goodtime. Chapter 1. The weather radio squawked from the kitchenette, a tinny voice predicting doom. John Bodirt Bohannon sat on the aluminum step of his Airstream, a disassembled Sig Sauer spread across a towel on his knees. The sun hadn't yet cleared the tree line, but the humidity already pressed against his skin like a wet hand. He worked the firing pin assembly with a cloth, wiping away carbon he couldn't see. Tropical depression forming southwest of the Cayman Islands, currently disorganized but showing signs of. He reached inside and thumbed the volume down. Not off. The radio stayed on. That was the rule. The Airstream sat centered on a concrete slab the size of a two-car garage. Weeds pushed through cracks in the foundation, thick, green, and indifferent. Around the slab, there was nothing but sand, scrub oak, and occasional palmettos rattling in the intracoastal breeze. The slab used to support a house. His house. Before the storm came through and scraped the lot clean, leaving nothing but this gray rectangle and a pile of debris the county hauled away 3 months later. He had parked the trailer there the week after they finished the debris removal. The city sent a zoning violation notice. He framed it and hung it inside above the fold-down table. The Sig went back together in sequence, each component seating with a sound he knew by heart. He cycled the slide, dry-fired once into the floor, and set the weapon on the step beside him. Across the slab, his 1986 square-body Ford F-250 sat sinking into the sand. Two-tone brown and tan, the paint oxidized to a matte finish that swallowed light. The front grille carried a dent from a deer 3 winters back. The deer walked away. The grille didn't. No GPS antenna, no OnStar, no satellite link. It had a carburetor, a manual transmission, and a radio that picked up AM if the wind blew the right direction. The government couldn't track it or shut it down remotely. They could only look at it and wonder why anyone still drove something that required a choke. He thought about that more than he should. A black Mercedes sedan came up the road slow, dust boiling behind it in the early light. The road was barely a suggestion, just 2 tire tracks worn through the sand between empty lots. Developers had bought them up, waiting for the market to turn or the next storm to clear the way. The Mercedes stopped at the edge of the slab. The engine idled for a long moment, air conditioning condensation dripping onto the sand. Then the driver's door opened and a woman stepped out. Bone-colored linen pants, a silk blouse, sunglasses with frames that probably cost more than his truck. Her dark hair was pulled back tight. She clutched her purse against her ribs like the scrub oaks might snatch it. John didn't stand. He picked up his coffee mug from the step and took a sip. The coffee had gone cold an hour ago. "You Bohannon?" she asked. "Depends on who's asking." "Patricia Wembley." She walked closer, her shoes sinking in the sand, and stopped at the edge of the slab. She looked at the Airstream, the truck, and the empty concrete. Her face didn't change, but something in her posture shifted. Recalibrating. Deciding if she had made a mistake. He'd seen that look before. Usually from people who drove black Mercedes sedans and expected private investigators to work out of offices with frosted glass and receptionists. "I need to hire you," she said. "You want to come in? I got more coffee. Hot this time." She glanced at the Airstream door, the aluminum skin streaked with oxidation, the awning torn loose on one corner. "I'll stand." John stood. He set the Sig on the kitchen counter inside the door, grabbed the coffee pot from the burner, and poured the cold contents into the sink. He started a fresh pot, the machine rattling against the counter. The whole trailer shook when he walked. He came back to the door and leaned against the frame. "What's the problem?" "My daughter. Chloe. She's 14. Patricia Wembley's jaw tightened around the words. "She's been gone 3 days. You report it." Of course, I reported it. And they took the report. Asked me if she had a boyfriend, if we'd argued, if she'd been acting out. They said she'd come home when her phone died and she got hungry. Her voice cracked on the last word. She pressed her lips together, waited a moment. They said she's a runaway. You think different. I know different. She pulled her phone from her purse, swiped the screen and held it out. John took the phone. The photo showed a girl with her mother's dark hair and a narrower face, a spray of freckles across her nose, and a smile that showed too much gum. She wore a private academy blazer with a crest. She was supposed to come home from school on Friday, Patricia said. Never made it. The school said she left at the usual time. Her friends said she walked out of the parking lot alone. No fight, no drama. She just disappeared. John handed the phone back. Kids run. 3 days is a long time to be mad about a curfew, though. She wouldn't miss the show. The show. Dateline. The one with Keith Morrison. We watch it together every Friday. For 2 years. She never misses it. She says it's our thing. Patricia's eyes glistened. She wasn't home Friday night, Mr. Bohannon. Didn't call. Didn't text. She just wasn't there. John looked past her toward the road. A brown anole scrambled up the trunk of a palm tree, stopped halfway, and pumped its throat at the sky. The humidity was burning off, the heat settling in for the day. You talked to her friends yourself? Everyone. They're 14. Scared. They don't know anything except what they see on TikTok. You talked to the cops again after they filed the report? I called yesterday. They told me runaways usually turn up within a week. Told me to be patient. She said the word like it tasted bad. They're not looking. They filed her picture in a binder, and they're waiting for her to walk back in so they can close the case. And you want me to look? I want you to find her. John scratched the stubble on his jaw. His fingers sounded like sandpaper. I'm not cheap. Patricia Wembley reached into her purse and pulled out a stack of hundreds wrapped in a blue rubber band. She set it on the step beside his coffee mug. That's 5,000, she said. There's more if you bring her home. John looked at the cash. He looked at the Ford, its transmission slipping in second gear, the rebuild kit he'd priced out last week, sitting in a browser tab on a borrowed library laptop. He looked at the empty concrete slab where his wife's house used to be. Before the divorce, before the storm, before everything went to sand. You got a picture printed? He asked. Patricia pulled a folded photograph from her purse and handed it over. The same school picture, printed on glossy paper, the corners already soft from handling. Last thing, John said. You tell anyone you were coming here. She shook her head. I found your name online. In a forum. Someone said you found their son when the police couldn't. They said you used to be a deputy. I used to be a lot of things. They said you were fired. John picked up the money and tucked it into his back pocket. The bills made a thick rectangle against his hip. I was. For excessive violence. That part of the forum, or did they leave that out? Patricia's face didn't change. They mentioned it. And you still drove out here in your Mercedes to hire a violent ex-deputy who lives in a trailer on a slab. She looked at the empty concrete again. Then she looked at him. For a moment, she wasn't the woman in linen pants with expensive sunglasses. She was a mother standing in the sand where someone else's life had washed away, holding a phone with her daughter's face on it. I drove out here, she said, because the police think my daughter ran away to get high with her friends. And I know she didn't. I know she's scared. And I know that if she's going to come home, it's going to be because someone who knows how to be violent found her first. She walked back to the Mercedes, her shoes leaving deep prints in the sand. She didn't look back. The sedan turned around in the scrub, dust rising behind it as it headed toward the highway. John stood in the doorway of his Airstream, the photograph in one hand, the money pressing against his leg. The coffee maker clicked off. The weather radio crackled. Expected to strengthen as it moves west-northwest, with models showing potential development into a tropical storm within 72 hours. He went inside and poured a cup of hot coffee black. He set the photograph on the fold-down table, next to the cig and the framed zoning violation. The girl stared up at him with her mother's dark hair and a smile full of too much gum. He pulled his phone from his pocket. The screen was cracked in one corner, the battery at 43%. He scrolled through contacts until he found a name, Serena, psychic. The phone rang 4 times. Madam Serena's House of Mystical Enlightenment. For appointments, press 1. For tarot readings, press 2. For all other inquiries, press 3. He pressed 3. The line clicked. A woman's voice, husky, amused. John Bohannon. I felt you calling before the phone rang. Bullshit. You never let me have anything. What do you need? Girl went missing 3 days ago. 14 years old, brown hair, private school. Name's Chloe Wembley. The universe doesn't give me names, John. It gives me signs. Symbols. Whispers. Then whisper me somewhere to start. A pause. He could hear music in the background, sitars and a lot of reverb. Come see me, Serena said. The Pink Flamingo. I'll do a reading. For old times. I don't believe in that crap. Of course you don't. That's why you call me every time a girl goes missing. Come see me, John. Bring cash. The spirits don't work for free. The line went dead. John set the phone on the table, picked up the cig, and slid it into the holster at the small of his back. He grabbed his keys from the hook by the door, stepped out into the heat, and locked the Airstream behind him. The sun was fully up, already pushing 90. The slab radiated heat against his boots. He walked to the Ford, opened the door, and the smell of old vinyl and gasoline rolled out to meet him. He sat behind the wheel for a moment, the photograph of Chloe Wembley on the passenger seat. He cranked the engine. It turned over twice, caught, and settled into a rough idle that shook the whole cab. He put it in gear, the transmission grinding for a second before it caught. Second gear was going to need that rebuild kit sooner than later. He pulled out onto the dirt track and headed east toward the highway. Behind him, the Airstream sat on its concrete slab, the weather radio still chattering to an empty room, predicting storms that hadn't yet arrived. Chapter 2. The Pink Flamingo Motel sat on a forgotten stretch of federal highway. Once it had been a destination, back when people drove down from Georgia and didn't care about thread count or room service. Now the ocean was 6 blocks away, and might as well have been 600. Bodirt parked the Ford. The truck's shadow cut across cracked asphalt dotted with stubborn weeds. The motel was 2 stories of faded coral stucco, a pink that started out bold and ended up exhausted. The plastic flamingos bolted to the roof were each missing at least one leg, leaning at angles that suggested they were considering a jump. A shirtless man sat in a plastic chair outside room 14, his chest a canvas of faded prison ink. He held a beer and stared at Bodirt with the particular emptiness of someone who had been up for 3 days and planned to stay up for 3 more. Bodirt nodded. The man didn't nod back. He climbed the exterior stairs to the 2nd floor, the metal treads ringing under his boots. Room 24 had a small plastic flamingo nailed to the door, this one intact, sporting a tiny top hat glued at a jaunty angle. A curtain of bone-colored beads hung in the doorway, clacking together in the breeze from a window unit that dripped condensation onto the walkway. Bodirt pushed through the beads. The room smelled like sandalwood, cigarette smoke, and the kind of cheap floral perfume they sold at the corner gas station. Dark purple fabric draped the walls, pinned up with thumbtacks. A small table sat in the center of the room, covered in blood-red velvet. On it, a grapefruit-sized crystal ball, a spread deck of tarot cards, and a jar candle burned down to a pool of black wax. Madame Serena sat behind the table, in a thrift store chair missing its left arm. She wore a purple silk robe, straight out of a cheap Halloween shop. Her dark hair fell past her shoulders, streaked with gray she didn't bother to hide. Her bourbon-colored eyes tracked him all the way across the room. "You're late," she said. "You said come see you. You didn't say when. The universe doesn't operate on your timeline, John." She gestured to a folding chair with a faded orange cushion. "Sit." He sat. The metal frame groaned. Serena picked up the tarot deck and shuffled it with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing card tricks since before Bodirt carried a badge. The soft, rhythmic slide of paper on paper filled the close air of the room. "You want me to read for the girl," she said. It wasn't a question. "I want you to tell me who to talk to. You never let the process unfold." She laid 3 cards face down on the velvet. "The cards speak. I listen. That's how it works. It's how it works when I'm paying for the psychic show. Today, I'm paying for information." Serena looked up, her eyes going flat. "You want information? Go to the police station and drink bad coffee. You came to me. We do this my way." Bodirt leaned back, the chair biting into his shoulders. "Fine. Do the cards." She flipped the first one. A man in a chariot, 2 horses, one black, one white, pulling in opposite directions. The chariot. "Control," Serena said. "Willpower. A journey." The girl didn't run. Someone took her, and he moves with purpose. Bodirt waited. She flipped the second card. A figure in a mask holding a cup, a grin painted on his face. The fool's grin, covering up the truth. "The masked man," Serena said, her voice dropping. "A man who wears happiness like a costume. He brings pleasure. He brings what looks like a good time." Her finger traced the card's edge. "But under the mask, there's nothing. Just need. Hunger." "Mr. Good Time," Bodirt said. Serena's eyes snapped to his. "You know the name. The cops used it a couple years back. Some girls went missing. They thought maybe there was a pattern. Never went anywhere. They called the suspect Mr. Good Time because he threw parties." "The parties?" Serena flipped the third card. A tower struck by lightning, figures plummeting from its windows. "The tower. That one means trouble," Bodirt said. "That one means everything you thought was solid is about to crumble." She placed her palm flat on the card. "There's a man. He finds girls. Young ones, the kind who still believe the world is safe. He doesn't grab them. He offers them a party. A chance to be somewhere they aren't supposed to be. And they go willingly. They go because he seems safe. Fun. The guy who throws parties and expects nothing in return." Serena's hand moved from the tower to the masked man. "But he expects everything. He collects them, John. And when he's done, when the shine wears off, he finds another one." Bodirt's jaw tightened. "You know someone he used. A recruiter." Serena pulled her hand back and let it rest in her lap. The candle flickered, sending shadows jumping across her face. "There's a kid. Calls himself Cricket. Works out of a grow house off Old Dixie, the abandoned golf course. He finds girls for private parties. The kind people pay big money to attend. Cricket know who he's working for? Cricket knows what he needs to know, which is nothing. The man pays cash. The man has a burner number. He picks up the girls from a location Cricket provides." She picked up the tarot cards and began shuffling again, the rhythm agitated now. Cricket doesn't ask questions. He cares about the cocaine he buys with the cash and the ego trip of working for a rich man. Where do I find him? Serena set the deck down. The cards slid against each other, settling into an uneven pile. She pulled a small notebook from the folds of her robe, tore out a page, and wrote something down. She slid the paper across the velvet. Bodirt picked it up. An address on Old Dixie Highway. A name. Cricket. "You owe me, John," Serena said. He reached into his pocket, pulled out $300 bills from Patricia Wembley's stack, and set them beside the candle. Serena looked at the money, then at him. "That's not what I meant." "I know." He stood, the folding chair scraping the floor. The beads clattered behind him as he pushed through the curtain. He stopped at the threshold, 1 foot on the metal walkway, the heat hitting his face like a wall. "Serena." "What?" "You see anything else? About the girl? About the clock she's on?" Serena sat very still behind her table. When she spoke, the showmanship was stripped away. "I see a young dove in a gilded cage. I see a man who thinks he's building something beautiful that will last forever. He's polishing his collection, getting ready to add a new piece." She looked up, and for a moment she wasn't Madame Serena the psychic hooker. She was a woman who knew exactly what happened to girls who got into cars with men who smiled too wide. "You have 3 days, John. Maybe 4. Then he moves on. Then she's not a girl anymore. She's a trophy." Bodirt nodded once. He stepped out onto the walkway and let the beads fall. The shirtless man was still in the plastic chair downstairs. A thin woman with chemical blonde hair and track marks on her thighs had joined him. She watched Bodirt cross the lot, her expression unreadable. He got in the Ford and cranked the engine. He looked at the paper Serena had given him. Cricket. Old Dixie. The abandoned golf course. He knew the place. An 80s relic built before the water table dropped and the greens went brown. Now it was a monument to bad decisions. The fairways overgrown and the clubhouse a boarded-up shell. The transmission ground going into reverse. He backed out, pulled onto Federal Highway and headed south. He kept the radio off. He didn't need the weather report to tell him what was coming. He could feel the pressure building in his bones, the stillness before the wind picked up. 3 days. Maybe 4. He pushed the Ford faster, the engine complaining, the speedometer needle wavering past 60. He turned onto Old Dixie Highway, the tires kicking up dust. In the rearview mirror, the pink flamingo shrank away, its one-legged birds leaning into the heat, waiting for the next storm to knock them down. Chapter 3. The entrance to the Lost Lagoon mini golf and driving range used to be a grand archway shaped like coral rock. Now the fiberglass letters lay cracked in the weeds. A plastic pirate, missing his hook hand, leaned against the ticket booth like a drunk waiting for last call. The chain across the entrance had been cut so many times the links lay scattered in the gravel like dropped change. Bodirt drove through. The Ford's suspension bottomed out in the potholes. The cart path snaked past what used to be the first hole, a windmill with 3 of its 4 blades gone, the remaining one creaking in the breeze. Past that, the second hole was a pirate ship. Its hull served as a planter for something growing tall and green that definitely wasn't fertilizer. He killed the engine and let the truck coast to a stop near the putting green. The green had gone to crabgrass years ago, but someone had mowed it close to the dirt recently. The flag stick was still in the cup, sporting a limp black trash bag instead of a pennant. A young man appeared from inside the pirate ship's hull. He was 22, maybe, with the hollow cheeks and bright eyes of a kid running on stimulants and spite. Straw-colored hair stood up in stiff spikes. He wore board shorts and a faded Salt Life tank top. His arms were thin, veins tracking under the skin, and he carried a putter with electrical tape wrapped around the grip. "This is private property," he said. "You need to turn around." "Looking for cricket," Bodirt said. The kid's eyes darted left, then right. His thumb worked the taped grip of the putter. "Don't know no cricket." "You're cricket." "I'm not." He stopped. "Who's asking?" Bodirt got out of the truck. He let the door swing shut, the sound echoing off the fiberglass pirate ship like a struck bell. He walked toward the young man, boots crunching on the gravel. "Name's Bohannon. I'm asking." Cricket took a step back, raising the putter. Not threatening. Protective. The way a child holds a stick in the dark. "I don't want no trouble." "Then we're on the same page." Bodirt stopped 10 feet away, close enough to see the sweat beaded on Cricket's upper lip. "You find girls for private parties. The kind where the host pays cash and doesn't ask for a receipt." "I don't know what you're." "You want to tell me that story again?" "Because I got all day. It's hot, I'm already in a bad mood, and I drove all the way out to this shithole because a psychic told me you might know something about a missing girl. We can stand here and play dumb, or you can tell me what I need to know, and I'll be out of your hair before your next crop flowers." Cricket's face went pale beneath his sunburn. "I don't. Who told you about the parties?" "Someone who thinks you're smarter than you look. Don't prove her wrong." The putter lowered. Cricket's shoulders sagged, the fight draining out of him. He looked at the ford, then at Bodirt, then at the sky, hoping for a distraction that wasn't coming. "Come on," he said. "It's cooler inside." He led the way through the hull of the pirate ship, stepping into what used to be a maintenance shed. Now it was a miniature grow house, producing just enough to keep a small crew of idiots from dealing with real cartel suppliers. 5-gallon buckets lined the walls, each holding a plant reaching toward a bank of jury-rigged grow lights. The air was damp and thick with the sweet musk of flowering cannabis. Cricket settled onto a milk crate, the putter across his knees. Bodirt stayed standing, back to the wall, letting his eyes adjust to the purple light. "You a cop?" Cricket asked. "Private." "That's worse. Cops, you know what they want. Private guys always want something weird." "I want a girl. Chloe Wembley. 14, brown hair, private school. Went missing Friday." Bodirt watched Cricket's face for a flicker of recognition. "Nothing." "I don't know no Chloe," Cricket said. "You find girls. Who do you find them for?" Cricket picked at a scab on his elbow, avoiding Bodirt's eyes. "It's not like that. It's just parties. Rich guy parties. They want girls to serve drinks, look pretty, keep the guests happy. No one gets hurt. I make sure of it." "You make sure of it from behind a taped-up putter in a fake pirate ship." "I screen them. I make sure they're 18. Some girls need the money. Chloe is 14. Cricket's hands went still. "I didn't. I never." "You get them from somewhere. Then they go somewhere." "Where?" The kid's mouth opened and closed. He looked at the plants, the lights, the putter. "Anywhere but Bodirt." "There's this guy," he said finally. "Calls himself Mr. Good Time. Pays cash, doesn't haggle. Wants girls with a certain look. Young. Fresh." He stopped. "Fresh what?" Cricket's voice dropped to a whisper. "He likes the ones who haven't figured out the world is just people taking from people. He says he likes the shine." Bodirt's hands curled into fists at his sides. He forced them open. "How many?" 3, maybe 4. Over the last year. He doesn't call often." "Where do you deliver them?" Cricket shook his head. "I don't. He has a burner number. I text him when I have someone. He texts back a location. I send the girl over. That's it. Give me the number." It's disconnected. He gets a new one every time. He's careful. Bodirt pushed off the wall and took a step toward the milk crate. Cricket flinched. The putter started to come up, but Bodirt grabbed the steel shaft and ripped it out of the kid's hands. Cricket didn't fight back. Bodirt tossed it into the corner. He stood over the young man, smelling the sour tang of his fear, cutting through the sweet chemical smell of the plants. You're going to tell me where he picks them up. I don't. You're going to tell me, Cricket, because you're the only thing standing between me and finding this girl. I have a very short fuse when it comes to people who traffic children. Understand? Cricket nodded fast, his whole body shaking. There's a place. A storage facility. Out past the agricultural land, near the levee. He has a unit there. He told me to send the girls, said he'd meet them with a car. What's the address? I don't know the exact address. It's just a dirt turnoff past the sugar fields. Unit 14. Cricket's face crumpled. He's going to kill me. If he finds out I talked, he's going to kill me. You don't know him. He's always calm. He smiles like he's watching a movie and already knows how it ends. He's not going to find out. Because you're done. Cricket blinked. What? You're done, Bodirt said. You're done finding girls. You're done with the parties. If I hear you're still in this business, I will come back here, and I won't ask questions. I'll just handle it. Clear. Cricket nodded, his head bobbing like a toy on a spring. I'm done. I swear. Bodirt turned and walked out of the purple light, back into the suffocating heat of the afternoon. He got into the Ford, the engine catching on the first turn. He put it in gear and pulled out of the overgrown lot, leaving the Lost Lagoon mini-golf and driving range behind him. He found Old Dixie Highway and pointed the truck south toward the agricultural land and the levee. Somewhere out there was a storage facility. Unit 14. He pressed the accelerator, listening to the transmission slip and the engine strain. The speedometer climbed. 3 days. Maybe 4. The clock was ticking, and he was tired of waiting. Chapter 4. The road turned from gravel to packed dirt, then dissolved entirely into 2 worn ruts cut through palmetto and pine. Bodirt followed Cricket's panicked directions from memory, pushing the Ford past the point where GPS maps gave up and showed nothing but green. The coastal humidity burned off as he drove west, replaced by the sharp chemical bite of fertilizer baking in the sun. Out here, the Everglades agricultural area stretched in a massive flat grid of irrigation canals and sugarcane running straight to the horizon. He spotted the galvanized metal roofs gleaming through a break in the trees. The storage facility sat on a cleared acre, a cluster of rectangular buildings arranged in 2 long rows. The corrugated steel was baked orange with rust. A chain-link fence ringed the property, but the gate hung wide open, its hinges sagging under their own weight. A padlock dangled from the hasp, unfastened. Someone had been in a hurry, or they just didn't care who wandered in. Bodirt killed the engine. The Ford ticked and pinged as it cooled. Brown dust drifted over the hood in the dead still air. No wind. No birds. Just the oppressive weight of the August sun and the electric hum of cicadas in the brush. He stepped out, his boots crunching on the baked earth, and scanned the rows. It felt like a graveyard. Not for bodies, but for bad ideas and forgotten lives abandoned out here in the heat. Most of the roll-down doors were secured by rusted locks or nothing at all. Some bore faded names scrawled in Sharpie, most were blank. Bodirt walked down the second row, sweat already pooling at the small of his back, his eyes tracking the dirt for signs of life. Unit 14 was tucked at the very back, pressed right up against the perimeter fence. The first thing Bodirt noticed was the lock. A fresh brass master lock, gleaming against the oxidized metal of the door. The hasp had been replaced too, the screws shiny, untouched by the coastal salt air. The second thing he noticed was the ground. Tire tracks. Passenger tread, cutting a sharp turn in the loose dirt right in front of the unit. They pulled up, sat for a while, and reversed out. The impressions were crisp. They'd been made last night, or maybe just a few hours ago. Bodirt pulled his multi-tool from his pocket and folded out the flathead driver. He'd popped 105-pin master locks back when he carried a sheriff's star and had probable cause backing his play. Now he just had a missing girl and a ticking clock. He slid the driver into the keyway, applying tension, feeling for the pins to bind. He gave it 20 seconds of patient, deliberate pressure, ignoring the sweat stinging his eyes. The shackle snapped open, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence. He slipped the brass lock free, set it gently on the dirt, and grabbed the door handle. It was heavy. The springs were old and rusted, fighting him all the way up, groaning in protest until the latch clicked into place overhead. The air that rolled out hit him like a physical blow. It was freezing. A heavy, artificial chill that immediately turned the sweat on his arms clammy. He stepped over the threshold, pulling the door back down slightly to hide the gap. The unit had active power, and a heavy-duty AC unit hummed in the dark, keeping the space at a temperature that defied the Florida summer outside. Bare corrugated walls. 20 feet deep, 10 feet wide. A single chair sat dead center, high-backed, upholstered in dark red velvet. It looked like a prop stolen from an old parlor. Above it hung a motionless disco ball, its mirrored facets catching the flat, merciless glare of a long-life bulb mounted on the ceiling. Then, Bodirt turned his attention to the far wall. It was covered in photographs. Polaroids, the instant kind with thick white borders, yellowing slightly at the edges. 9 of them, arranged in a precise grid against the metal. Bodirt stepped closer, the cold biting through his thin shirt. 9 young women. All with brown hair. All with wide eyes and shy, trusting smiles. The faces were different, but the essence was identical. They were girls who hadn't yet figured out that a smile could be a trap. Dates were written beneath each picture in neat, meticulous black marker. Bodirt traced the timeline with his eyes. The oldest was 2 years ago. The gaps between the dates shrank as he moved across the grid. 4 months. Then 3. Then 2. Then a matter of weeks. The pattern was accelerating. The most recent photo sat dead center. Chloe Wembley. The same school picture her mother had handed him on the steps of the Airstream, her freckles dark against the glossy film. The date beneath her face was 3 days old. The day she vanished. To the right of the photo collage, a small metal shelf held a glass display case. It was the kind jewelers used to present high-end watches, lined with black velvet. Inside rested a row of cufflinks. 7 of them. Silver, gold, mother-of-pearl, onyx. Each one unique, polished to a mirror shine. Bodirt counted the slots. 8 indentations in the velvet. The 8th slot was empty. He stood perfectly still in the freezing air. He didn't touch the glass, didn't touch the photos. He let his detective instincts catalog the grim math of the scene. 9 girls on the wall. 7 cufflinks in the case. 1 empty slot waiting to be filled. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the cheap, disposable camera he'd bought at a CVS on Federal Highway. He framed the shot. The flash popped, a blinding burst of white in the dim unit, freezing the collage. He wound the film, stepping sideways. Another flash for the dates. Another for the velvet case. Another for the empty chair. He shot the entire roll, the mechanical click and whine of the camera the only sound besides the humming AC. When the dial stopped turning, Bodirt shoved the camera back into his pocket. He took one last look at the 9 faces staring back at him. Somewhere out there, the man who owned this lock was polishing that 8th cufflink. Bodirt ducked under the door, heaved it back down until the latch engaged, and snapped the brass padlock back into place. The metal was already warming up in the sun. The cold air seeping from the seams mixed with the blistering heat of the lot, swirling around his boots in a thin fog. He walked back to the Ford, his stride longer, harder. He climbed behind the wheel, ignoring the stifling heat trapped in the cab. The camera pressed against his ribs like a rock. The gaps were closing. The pattern was tightening into a noose. 3 days since Chloe disappeared. The clock was running out faster than he'd thought. Bodirt slammed the truck into gear, the transmission grinding in protest, and tore out of the facility, leaving a plume of brown dust in his wake. He had a suspect, a pattern, and a pocket full of photographic evidence. Now he just needed to find a cop desperate enough to use it. Chapter 5. The Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office occupied a building that tried desperately to look like it belonged in the 21st century. It was all glass and steel, clean architectural lines, and a flagpole out front snapping the stars and stripes against a sky the color of a dirty oyster. But the employee parking lot told the real story. Rows of Crown Victorias and Ford Explorers baked in the sun, their paint worn thin by a decade of brutal summers. Hubcaps were missing. Bumpers carried scuffs from 1,000 trips down roads that ate patrol cars for breakfast. Bodirt parked his truck in a spot marked Visitor and sat behind the wheel for a minute, letting the engine cool down. The metal ticked and popped, the sound of a machine pushed too hard and asking for a break it wasn't going to get. He reached into his jacket, pulled out the disposable camera, and checked the plastic casing. The film was intact. 9 faces. 7 cufflinks. 1 empty slot. He climbed out, crossed the blistering asphalt, and pushed through the heavy glass doors into air conditioning so aggressive it made his skin tighten. The lobby was cavernous and empty, save for a desk sergeant sitting behind a pane of bulletproof acrylic. Her hair was the color of steel wool, and she wore her reading glasses perched at the very tip of her nose, looking down at paperwork that seemed to personally disappoint her. "Help you?" she asked, not looking up. "Need to see whoever's running the Wembley missing persons case." The sergeant finally raised her eyes, peering at him over the rims of her glasses. "You family. Private investigator. I have evidence relevant to the case." She let that hang in the freezing air, her gaze dragging over his scuffed boots, the worn denim, the jacket that had seen better decades. Then she picked up her desk phone, punched a 3-digit extension, and spoke into the receiver in a voice too low to carry through the glass. She hung up and nodded toward a hard plastic bench against the far wall. "Someone will be out." Bodirt didn't sit. He stood by the window, watching the heat shimmer rising off the parking lot. His Ford sat in its spot like a stray dog, waiting for its owner to come back. The minutes dragged. The massive AC units hummed overhead. The sergeant completely ignored him. The heavy security door to the left of the desk finally clicked open. The woman who walked through was younger than Bodirt expected, maybe 35, with sharp angular features and dark hair pulled back so tight it stretched the skin at her temples. She wore a tailored navy blazer over a crisp white button-down. Her only jewelry was a plain wedding band and a stainless steel watch with a face too big for her wrist. Her badge hung from a chain around her neck, and she carried a thick manila file folder tucked under one arm like a shield. She stopped a few feet away, evaluating him with the deliberate, clinical gaze of a mechanic staring down an engine block with a blown head gasket. "John Bohannon." "Detective." "I'm Detective Rivas. Isabella Rivas." She didn't offer her hand. "You want to tell me why you're taking up space in my lobby? You're on the Wembley case." "The Wembley case is active, and I'm the investigating officer." She tapped the thick folder against her thigh. "Now, you want to tell me why a private investigator with a documented history of excessive violence and a revoked license." license is active. Is inserting himself into an ongoing missing persons investigation. I'm not inserting myself. I was hired by Patricia Wembley. She didn't think this department was doing its job. Revis's jaw tightened. The movement was small, barely a twitch, but Bodirt caught it. He saw her fingers dig into the cardboard folder, and her weight shift onto her back foot. She'd been waiting for that line. She had probably heard it from every terrified parent who walked through these doors, leaving with nothing but a case number and a glossy pamphlet about runaway resources. Mrs. Wembley is entitled to her opinion, Revis said, her voice smooth and cold. She's also entitled to throw her money at whoever she wants. But you don't get to interfere with my work. You don't get to interview witnesses. You don't contaminate crime scenes, and you sure as hell don't present yourself as law enforcement. You cross those lines, I will have you arrested and booked before the sun goes down. Do we understand each other? I understand perfectly. Good. Revis turned on her heel, starting back toward the security door. I'll have the sergeant buzz you out. I found the storage unit. Revis stopped dead. Her back was to him, the navy blazer pulling tight across her shoulders. For 2 full seconds, she didn't move a muscle. When she finally turned around, her face was a carefully constructed blank slate. What storage unit? The one where your Mr. Goodtime keeps his collection. 9 Polaroids of young women, dates written on the bottom of each one, stretching back 2 years. 7 cufflinks laid out in a glass case. An empty slot waiting for number 8. The AC is running 24 hours a day to keep everything preserved just right. Bodirt pulled the CVS camera from his jacket and held it up in the fluorescent light. I got pictures. Revis stared at the cheap plastic camera. Her expression remained neutral, but Bodirt saw the heavy steel doors locking down behind her eyes. She walked back toward him, her heels clicking sharply against the tile, stopping close enough that he could catch the faint, unexpected scent of floral perfume. Where did you get that camera, Bohannon? Where do you think? You broke into a storage unit. You compromised a lock that wasn't yours, entered a private space without legal consent, and photographed someone else's property. That's breaking and entering. That's illegally obtained evidence. You just handed any half-decent defense attorney a motion to dismiss. You want to talk about things getting dismissed? There are 9 girls on that wall, Detective. 9. And your department filed Chloe Wembley as a routine runaway. Revis's hand twitched. For a split second, Bodirt thought she was going to grab the camera. Instead, her fingers curled into a tight fist at her side. She took a slow, deep breath, counting backward in her head. Bodirt had seen that specific breathing technique before. It was what good cops did when they were desperately trying not to hit someone. You think I don't know, she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. You think I don't know what's hanging on that wall? You think I don't know about the cufflinks, the dates, the specific victimology? I've known for 6 months. Ever since the second girl went missing. I built the profile. I'm the one who gave him the name, Mr. Goodtime, because that's what the terrified witnesses called him. The ones who managed to get away. She stepped closer, the professional distance evaporating. Up close, Bodirt saw the fine, exhausted lines framing her eyes, the permanent mark of staring at computer screens at 2 in the morning when the rest of the precinct was dark. I took that profile to my captain, Revis said, her anger finally bleeding through. I took it to the lieutenant, the major, and the assistant chief. I laid out the mo. I told them we had a highly organized serial predator operating in Palm Beach County, targeting young women, and that if we didn't act immediately, he was going to escalate. She stopped. Her fist opened and closed against her thigh. They told me to close the file. They told me Mr. Goodtime was a phantom, a statistical anomaly that only existed in my spreadsheets. They told me to focus on active cases with bodies, physical evidence, and suspects they could actually put in front of a grand jury. They told me to wait. How many bodies have to pile up before they let you work your own case? Revis's eyes flashed. You think I don't ask myself that every time my alarm goes off? You think I don't look at those faces and wonder which one is going to finally bleed enough to get their attention? She yanked the folder from under her arm, flipped it open, and pulled out an 8x10 glossy. She shoved it toward Bodart's chest. Sarah Keene. The same photograph the manager Earl had shown him at the storage facility. Sarah Keene. 23, Revis recited, the details burned into her memory. Disappeared from her shift at a seafood restaurant on February 16th. Last seen getting into a dark sedan. The witness described the driver as a white male in his 40s, clean-shaven, wearing a light-colored suit. Said he had a nice smile. Said he seemed like a real gentleman. She shoved Sarah's photo to the back and pulled the next one. Maria Santos. 19. Vanished from a bus stop on June 3rd. Last seen talking to a well-dressed man in a light-colored sedan. Witness said he was friendly. Liked his smile. Revis snapped the folder shut and jammed it back under her arm. I have 6 more in here. 6 more faces, 6 more witnesses who saw a nice man in a nice car. I have the profile, the timeline, the suspect description. I have everything except a corpse, a name, and a captain with enough spine to let me do my job. Bodirt looked at the thick manila folder. But you knew about the storage unit. I suspected a storage unit. I didn't know which one. These places are cash only, the rental records are paper, and the managers hate cops. We put out a bolo for the sedan and pulled a list of facilities within a 20-mile radius of the abduction sites. But without a name, without probable cause, without a judge signing a warrant. She let the sentence hang in the freezing air. So you sat on it. I sat on it while I worked the cases they actually assigned me. I waited for this guy to make a mistake. A traffic violation, a fingerprint left on a gas pump, anything that would give me the leverage to bypass my captain and go straight to a judge. She stared at the disposable camera in Bodart's hand. The frustration in her eyes morphed into something darker. Envy. And then you show up, she said bitterly. A disgraced pie with a violence jacket, who doesn't give a damn about the Fourth Amendment. You cracked that lock, walked right in, and photographed the Holy Grail. And now you have evidence I can't touch. Evidence that would poison my entire case the second a defense attorney filed for discovery. You want to arrest me. I want to arrest you so badly my teeth ache, Revis said, taking a deliberate step back to put space between them. But I'm not going to. Because you have a location. You have the timeline, confirming my profile. And if I lock you up, that evidence goes into an evidence locker, the chain of custody breaks, and this guy keeps hunting. So how do we play this? Revis glanced over her shoulder at the security doors, then at the desk sergeant, who was aggressively pretending not to listen. She lowered her voice to a hum. You walk out of my lobby. You take your drugstore camera and your illegally obtained photos and you follow your leads. You rattle the cages I can't touch. You find me something clean. Something that didn't come from a busted padlock. You're outsourcing your badge. I want you to find Chloe Wembley before she becomes Polaroid number 8. And when you find something real, something I can actually use to secure a warrant, you call me. You don't call the mother. You don't leak it to the press. You call me directly. She pulled a stark white business card from her blazer pocket and held it out. It listed her name, rank, and a direct cell number. Nothing else. Bodirt took it and slid it into his jacket beside the camera. "And if I corner him before you get your piece of paper?" Revis's expression went dead flat. "Then you do what you do, Bohannon. And I do what I have to do, which is hunt you down and make sure whatever happens next happens inside a courtroom." The courtroom hasn't done much for those 9 girls. No, it hasn't. She studied his face for a long moment, reassessing him. "You know what the old-timers in this building say about you. They say you used to be the best tracker we had. They say you found the people no one else could find, and you closed the cases that were supposed to stay open. They also say I beat a suspect half to death in a Winn-Dixie parking lot. They say that too." She nodded toward the glass exit doors. "Go. Find the girl. Hand me something I can use. And for God's sake, stay out of my way while you do it." Bodirt turned and walked toward the exit, the camera pressing a hard line against his ribs. He pushed through the heavy glass, trading the sterile chill of the precinct for the suffocating humidity of the parking lot. He climbed into the Ford, the brown vinyl seats burning through his jeans, and pulled Revis's card from his pocket. A name and a number. The heavy weight of a 6-month bottleneck waiting to blow. He fired up the engine and looked back at the building. Through the glare of the glass lobby doors, he could see Revis still standing there watching him. She still had the folder tucked under her arm, guarding the faces of 9 girls who had been waiting far too long for someone to break the rules. She wasn't the political appointee he'd expected. She wasn't a PR-friendly diversity hire, playing it safe for a promotion. She was a furious, handcuffed cop waiting for a match to strike. Bodirt shifted the truck into gear and pulled out onto Federal Highway. The card sat on the passenger seat. The camera sat in his pocket. The road stretched out flat and white under the brutal sun. He had a name. Mr. Goodtime. A ghost who collected young women and pinned them to a wall. Bodirt pressed his boot down on the accelerator, listening to the Ford's engine roar in protest, and drove faster. Chapter 6. The horse ranch sat at the dead end of a road that had long ago crumbled from asphalt to shell rock, and from shell rock to pure sand. Wellington had mutated in the 20 years since the cocaine cowboys treated it as their personal playground. The sprawling equestrian estates were steadily losing ground to cookie-cutter gated communities and high-end strip malls. Old money was pushing out the dirty money, forcing guys like Wade Crawley further west, out past the point where the pavement ended and the GPS screens went blank. Crawley's ranch occupied 40 acres of former sugar land. The soil was too rich for anything but grass, and the grass was too aggressively green for anything but thoroughbred horses. It was the sort of operation where no one from the county zoning board ever drove out to ask where the funding originated. Bodirt aimed the Ford through a set of wrought iron gates that were strictly for show. The white concrete columns anchoring them were topped with decorative spheres, cracked by lightning strikes and never repaired. A long driveway wound through a dense grove of live oaks, their branches choked with Spanish moss that hung dead and motionless in the heavy afternoon heat. The trees broke, opening onto a scene that made Bodirt ease his foot off the gas and let the truck crawl. The main house was a massive Spanish Revival structure, straight out of the 1920s rum-running era. White stucco, red clay tile roof, and a central courtyard featuring a fountain that shot a geyser of water 20 feet into the blistering air. But the fountain wasn't what commanded attention. It was the swimming pool. The pool was shaped like a giant antique skeleton key. The water glowed radioactive, postcard turquoise. And lounging around the perimeter, occupying teakwood deck chairs that cost more than Bodirt's truck, was a troop of Capuchin monkeys. They were dressed in miniature sailor suits. Striped shirts, little white caps, tiny trousers with brass buttons. One of them sat at the very edge of the keyhole pool, dipping its tail into the water, watching Bodirt's approaching truck with the exhausted, cynical intelligence of a creature that had seen entirely too much of human behavior. Bodirt parked the Ford in the shade of a massive banyan tree whose roots had violently buckled the flagstone patio. He killed the engine and sat behind the wheel. He looked at the monkeys. The monkeys stared back. The small one by the water adjusted its white cap and casually scratched its belly. "You lost." The voice boomed from the direction of the courtyard. Bodirt turned his head. Wade Crawley stood in the arched doorway, a towel draped around his neck. He had a chest the size of a whiskey barrel, and skin baked to the color of a well-used saddle. He was pushing 60, his white hair cropped military close, his eyes the pale washed-out blue of a winter sky. He wore loose board shorts, rubber flip-flops, and absolutely nothing else. His torso was a roadmap of violent history, puckered bullet holes, jagged knife tracks, and one long, straight surgical scar that had saved his life while taking something irreplaceable in the process. Crawley looked at the rusted Ford, then at Bodirt, then at the monkeys. His face split into a wide grin, showing a fortune in dental veneers. "Well, I'll be damned. John Bohannon. Last I heard, you were scrubbing toilets in a Pompano trailer park." "Last I heard, you were dead," Bodirt said, stepping out of the cab. "Rumors of my demise have been greatly exaggerated." Crawley walked toward the truck, his flip-flops slapping loudly against the heated stone. He hit Bodirt on the shoulder with a heavy, calloused hand, rocking him back on his heels. "Mark Twain said that. Or maybe Oscar Wilde. One of those dead white guys who knew how to turn a phrase. Come on. You look like you need a drink. Hell, you always looked like you needed a drink." He didn't wait for an answer. Crawley turned and walked back toward the house, his massive bulk shifting with the easy, rolling grace of a man who had spent his entire life around dangerous animals and learned to move like one. Bodirt followed, stepping carefully over a monkey sprawled across the flagstone path, its cap pulled over its eyes to block the sun. The courtyard opened onto a wide rear patio overlooking the paddocks. A dozen sleek horses stood clustered in the shade of a solitary oak, their tails swishing lazily at flies. Beyond the wooden fences, the land stretched perfectly flat and green all the way to the horizon, pinned down by a white-hot dome of sky. Crawley led him to an outdoor bar built seamlessly into the side of the house. The countertop was a solid slab of polished petrified wood. The heavy stools were upholstered in the same premium leather used for the riding saddles in the barn. Crawley grabbed a bottle containing a dark amber liquid, no label, no tax stamp, and poured 2 generous glasses. He slid one across the smooth stone and settled onto a stool that groaned in protest under his weight. "To old times," Crawley said, raising his glass. "And new times. And whatever the hell we're doing in between." Bodirt tapped his glass against Crawley's and took a sip. The whiskey was liquid velvet, the product of a distillery that had been perfecting its mash for 2 centuries and felt absolutely no need to advertise. "You didn't burn a gallon of gas driving out here just to drink my private stock," Crawley said, setting his glass down. "What do you need?" "A name." Crawley's grin faded, settling into something sharper and significantly more guarded. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching it catch the harsh sunlight. "Names are expensive commodities, John. You know the rules. I'm not in the business of giving away intelligence I spent 30 years bleeding to collect. I'm not asking for a handout. I'm calling in my marker." Crawley's pale eyebrows went up. "A marker? You saved my horses. That was 15 years ago. You saved my stock from a barn fire that miraculously never happened, started by an arsonist who officially never existed, preventing a crime nobody was ever charged with. That marker has been sitting in your pocket so long, it's fossilized. The fire was real. The man with the torch was real. I just made sure the problem got solved somewhere else. You made sure it happened to someone who had it coming." Crawley wiped a ring of condensation off the petrified wood. That was always your talent, John. You found the people who deserved the bad things, and you hand-delivered the consequences. Then they took your badge because polite society decided monsters deserved defense attorneys instead of broken jaws. They took my badge because I hit a suspect a few dozen times too many in a parking lot. Did you? Bodirt didn't answer. He just stared out at the horses. Crawley let out a rough laugh that sounded like gravel sliding down a metal chute. Exactly. You're not a bad man, John. You're just a man exhausted from pretending the rules work. He picked up his glass and drained it in one swallow. All right. Who's the name? Harry P. Dugan. The name hung suspended in the humid air between them. Crawley stared out at the paddocks, his face going completely still. It was the sudden, heavy stillness of the ocean right before a squall line hits. Dugan, he said quietly. Haven't heard that name out loud in a while. You know him. I know of him. Everyone who handles substantial sums of cash in South Florida knows of him. He drifted down from New York in the late 90s, right when the first massive wave of tech money started washing through the Tri-County area. Made an absolute fortune in high-end event planning, corporate retreats, themed blowouts, high-level distractions for executives who wanted to pretend they weren't just selling widgets. He had a terrifying knack for it. He knew what a man wanted before the man even realized he was hungry. Crawley picked up the unlabeled bottle and poured himself another 2 fingers. He didn't offer to top off Bodirt's glass. Then the music stopped. A private retreat went sideways. A girl vanished into thin air. There was a massive civil lawsuit, a sealed settlement, and a mountain of cash changing hands in the dark to ensure the story never made the Miami Herald. Dugan disappeared for a few years. When he finally surfaced again, he was different. Quiet. Substantially richer. He bought a fortress out on the island. High walls, localized security grids, and a gate that stays shut unless you know the blood code. You ever do business with him? Crawley scoffed. He doesn't deal with gutter trash like me, John. He operates above the grime. He doesn't buy his girls off the street. He finds them. He scouts the high schools, the upscale malls, the places where young girls congregate to be seen. He isolates them and makes them feel like they're the only living, breathing thing in the room. He makes them believe he sees a spark in them that the rest of the world missed. He took a long drink, his pale eyes tracking a horse moving across the grass. You know what the girls call him? The ones who get pulled into his orbit and invited to the private estates. They call him Mr. Good Time, because he delivers exactly that. A spectacular, reality-altering good time. And then they disappear. Bodirt's grip tightened on his glass. You know about the private parties. I know what the whispers say. I know he throws parties that never hit social media. I know he likes his guests young, fresh, and naive enough not to know how to locate the nearest exit. You ever attend one? Crawley looked at Bodirt, and for a fleeting second the ex-smuggler looked genuinely rattled. It wasn't the fear of a man who had survived bullets and blades. It was a deeper, primal unease. The look of a man who had witnessed something he couldn't control or shoot his way out of. I got an invitation once. A decade ago. A business associate thought it would be highly beneficial for me to shake Dugan's hand and see how the new money celebrated. I went. I walked through his front gate, stepped into the main foyer, saw what was happening, turned right around and walked back to my car. What was happening? Crawley shook his head. You don't need the visuals. You just need the intel. Dugan isn't a normal man. He's an empty space wearing a linen suit. He talks with a human voice and smiles with a human mouth, but there is absolutely nothing operating underneath the hood. Just a bottomless, yawning hole that he tries to fill with young girls, discarding them the second the novelty wears off. Crawley stood up from the stool and walked to the edge of the patio, leaning against a thick wooden post. A horse lifted its head, watched him for a moment, and went back to grazing. "You want Dugan. You need to corner his caterer. She runs the logistics for his parties. She brings the food, the booze, the servers. She sees who walks through the front door. And more importantly, she knows exactly who doesn't walk out when the sun comes up. Give me a name." "Blue Lagoon Catering. They run out of a commercial kitchen on the island. Owner's name is Delia. Delia something. I can't pull the last name. But she's your weak link. She sees everything." Crawley turned back to the bar, grabbed the heavy bottle of whiskey, and held it out. "Take it. You're going to need the courage before this particular job is over." Bohannon took the bottle, feeling the weight of the thick glass. "You think I'm going to find him. I know you're going to find him. That's what you do. You locate the people who think their money makes them invisible, and you drag them into the light." Crawley tapped Bodart's chest, a surprisingly gentle gesture. "But tread lightly. Dugan doesn't rely on armed guards or heavily fortified convoys. He relies on something far more dangerous. He has a gravity that makes people want to protect him. He makes people actively choose to look the other way." "How does he do that?" Crawley looked up at the oppressive white sky pressing down on the flat green earth. "He makes them believe the good times will never end." Bodirt walked back to the ford with the bottle tucked under his arm. The crushing heat radiated off the flagstones. The monkeys watched him pass from their deck chairs. The small one with the wrinkled face had pulled a striped towel over itself, cap still on, looking like a tiny, exhausted sailor sleeping off a brutal shore leave. Bodirt climbed into the stifling cab and set the bottle on the passenger seat next to Detective Revis's business card and the cheap disposable camera. He cranked the engine, listening to it cough before settling into a rough idle. He took one last look at the Spanish Revival house, the keyhole pool, and the heavily scarred man leaning against the patio post. Harry P. Dugan. A man who convinced people the party would go on forever. Bodirt wrestled the shifter into gear and pulled out of the driveway, rumbling past the cracked columns and the useless wrought iron gates. The whiskey bottle rolled across the cracked vinyl seat, coming to rest against the photograph of a 14-year-old girl whose time was rapidly bleeding out. Bodirt pressed his boot down on the accelerator. The tires bit into the asphalt, carrying him west toward the island, toward the high walls, and toward the caterer who knew exactly where the bodies were buried. Chapter 7. Elysian Estates sat on the southern tip of the island, a gated fortress carved out of 50 acres of prime mangrove swamp and former bird sanctuary. The developers had simply bulldozed old Florida out of the way to pour 40 massive concrete foundations. The lots sold for 7 figures before the first shovel hit the dirt. The McMansions went up in 18 months. The federal environmental lawsuits started 6 months after that, resulting in a few multi-million-dollar settlements that cost nothing to fix and everything to bury. Bodirt had worked security at one of these estates back when he still carried a badge. It was a cash-under-the-table side gig, requiring a navy blazer and a willingness to stand completely still while people in evening gowns filed into charity fundraisers. He remembered the way those guests looked right through him, their eyes sliding past his face to settle on something more expensive. He remembered how the air smelled inside those high stucco walls. It smelled like heavily air-conditioned money. The main gatehouse had been seriously upgraded since his deputy days. The old wooden shack was gone, replaced by a coral stone and bullet-resistant glass structure. Automatic steel arms blocked the road, and high-resolution cameras mounted on swivel poles tracked every approaching vehicle. A private security guard sat inside his climate-controlled box, wearing a crisp uniform and reflective sunglasses, his hand resting on a clipboard that provided nothing but the illusion of authority. Bodirt pulled the Ford to the shoulder, 50 yards short of the entrance. He killed the engine and sat in the deep shade of a sprawling banyan tree, its thick roots cracking the municipal sidewalk. He let the truck idle down. The temperature gauge slowly dropped, the metal ticking as it cooled. Every time he shifted his weight, the heavy bottle of unlabeled whiskey Wade Crawley had given him rolled across the floorboard. He hadn't opened it. Some things you saved for when the blood dried and the job was finally done. He watched the gate for an hour. A black Mercedes glided out, driven by a woman with silver hair and oversized sunglasses. A white Range Rover followed, its windows tinted so dark it looked like it was driving itself. No cars went in. The guard checked his phone, adjusted his sunglasses, and checked his phone again. The pole cameras swiveled back and forth, tracking absolutely nothing. At 2 o'clock, a white box truck rumbled down the access road from the highway. It was a standard, commercial catering rig. The logo painted on the side featured a stylized woman diving into turquoise water, arms stretched out like wings. Blue Lagoon Catering. The truck slowed at the gate. The driver rolled down the window, flashed a laminated card, and the guard waved him through without a second glance. No clipboard check. No trunk inspection. Bodirt waited 30 seconds, fired up the Ford, and rolled forward. Instead of turning into the main entrance, the box truck veered onto a narrow perimeter street running along the back side of the estates. Bodirt hung back, watching the truck approach a service entrance most of the residents probably didn't even know existed. The gate here wasn't coral stone and glass. It was heavy chain link, rusted at the bottom, secured with a heavy padlock. The truck stopped. A kid hopped out, maybe 20 years old, arms thin as rake handles, unlocked the gate, drove through, and locked it behind him. Bodirt parked at the curb, watching the truck disappear down a gravel track cut between the wall and a dense stand of Australian pines. He walked up to the chain link and inspected the lock. It was another 5-pin master. He could pop it in under a minute. But he didn't. He walked back to the Ford and waited. 10 minutes later, the kid returned, ran the truck through the gate, locked it back up, and headed toward the highway. Bodirt let him go. He wasn't here to shake down a delivery boy. He was here for the woman who signed the paychecks. He sweated out another 2 hours. The sun dragged across the sky, lengthening the shadows and baking the inside of the truck. A FedEx driver pulled up to the main gate. The guard waved him through. A landscaping crew, hauling a trailer full of palm fronds, got the same treatment. The pattern was obvious. The guard wasn't running a security checkpoint. He was just a warm body in a pressed shirt. At 4 o'clock, the white Blue Lagoon truck returned. This time, it didn't detour to the service entrance. It pulled right up to the front gate. The driver rolled down the window, revealing a woman in her mid-40s with short, sand-colored hair and arms showing the lean muscle of someone used to hauling her own equipment. She wore a tank top, cargo shorts, and a baseball cap with the company logo. She traded a few words with the guard. He nodded, and the heavy steel arms swung open. Bodirt waited until her truck cleared the entrance, then pulled the rusted Ford right up to the gatehouse. The guard stepped out of his booth, clipboard in hand, his reflective lenses aimed squarely at Bodirt's windshield. "Help you?" "Need to see Harry Dugan." The guard's posture stiffened immediately. His weight shifted to his back foot, and his grip tightened on the clipboard. "Mr. Dugan is not receiving visitors." "I'm not a visitor. I'm a vendor. Blue Lagoon sent me to fix an issue with the chafing dishes for his event." The guard looked at the Ford, taking in the oxidized paint, the rust eating the quarter panels, and the caved-in front grille. His lip twitched. "You don't look like catering repair. I'm the guy who fixes the expensive equipment the caterers manage to break." You want to call Mr. Dugan and tell him the Blue Lagoon repair tech is here. He'll understand. The guard stared at Bodirt for a long, tense moment. Then he walked back into the booth, picked up a heavy landline receiver, pressed a speed dial button, and spoke quietly. When he emerged, the skepticism was gone, replaced by the distinct wariness of a man who had just been ordered to let a wolf into the pasture. He says 10 minutes. The main house. Don't go anywhere else. The gate swung open. Bodirt drove through. The interior of Elysian Estates was a masterclass in what aggressive wealth could accomplish when divorced entirely from good taste. The lots were massive, the houses bloated. The landscaping looked unnatural, trucked in from homestead nurseries and pruned into rigid geometric shapes. Dugan's property sat isolated at the end of a deep cul-de-sac. The lot was easily double the size of its neighbors, completely obscured behind a 12-foot white stucco wall topped with decorative iron spikes. The driveway gate was heavy wrought iron, humming audibly with an electric current. Bodirt pulled up to the gate and waited. A pole-mounted camera swiveled down, its red recording light blinking steadily. He stared directly into the lens, his face deadpan. The gate clicked and swung inward. The long driveway curved gracefully through a grove of smooth-trunked royal palms, revealing the main house. Wade Crawley had been right. Dugan's setup didn't look like a home. It was a Greek Revival monstrosity that belonged on a historic plantation, completely out of place in South Florida. 2-story white columns supported a massive portico. The tall windows were sealed tight behind dark green hurricane shutters. In the center of the circular driveway, a marble statue of a boy holding a dolphin spilled water into a basin thick with green algae. Bodirt parked the Ford in the shade of a massive ancient banyan tree. He cut the engine, stepped out, and walked toward the front entrance. His heavy boots echoed against the flagstone, the sound bouncing off the pristine white walls. The front door opened before his knuckles hit the wood. The woman from the catering truck stood in the threshold. Up close, her features were sharp and exceedingly watchful. She had stripped off the baseball cap, and she watched Bodirt with the blank indifference of someone expecting a problem and deciding to handle it immediately. "You're not from Blue Lagoon," she said. "No." "Then why are you standing on my client's porch?" Bodirt reached into his jacket, pulled out the battered glossy photograph of Chloe Wembley, and held it up to the light. "I'm looking for this girl. 14 years old. Disappeared 3 days ago." The woman's eyes flicked to the photo, then back to Bodirt's face. The recognition was instantaneous. She didn't recognize Chloe specifically, but she recognized the aesthetic. The brown hair, the shy smile. The exact demographic that ended up pinned to a wall in a climate-controlled storage unit. "I don't know her," she said evenly. "You don't know her, or you're paid not to know her." Her jaw tightened. Her hand gripped the edge of the heavy door. "You need to leave before I call estate security." "You already called security. That's why the guard buzzed me in. You told him 10 minutes because you wanted to see exactly who was asking questions. So here I am. Asking." She studied his face, a rapid calculation working behind her sharp eyes. Finally, she took a step back and pulled the door wider. 5 minutes. Bodirt stepped inside. The foyer was a cavernous 2-story echo chamber. Hand-painted wallpaper depicted an ancient mythological garden scene. A crystal chandelier the size of a compact car hung suspended over the flawless white marble floor, casting shattered prisms of light across the room. She led him down a wide hallway, passing rooms furnished with rigid, uncomfortable antiques and massive oil paintings. She finally stopped in a glass-walled sunroom at the back of the house, overlooking a lush tropical courtyard and a pristine turquoise swimming pool. A stone path led from the pool deck toward a smaller, separate outbuilding partially hidden by trees. "I'm Delia," she said, crossing her bare arms over her chest. And you're a man who lied to a security guard and trespassed into a private residence. You have 3 minutes left. You run the logistics for Harry Dugan's private parties, Bodirt said, ignoring the threat. The high-end events where people pay serious cash to forget the rules. I cater for a lot of wealthy clients. Dugan is just one account. He's the account who likes his serving staff exceptionally young. Brown hair. Shy smiles. A very specific look. Delia's expression didn't flinch, but her arms tightened. I have no idea what you're talking about. I think you do. I think you load up that white truck with top-shelf liquor and hors d'oeuvres. You drive out here, and you watch those girls disappear into the back rooms. And you never ask where they go, because you physically cannot afford to know. Get out. Bodirt took a slow step forward. I'm not leaving until you tell me where he took her. Delia held her ground, her face suddenly inches from his. He could see the exhaustion etched deep into her skin. It was the heavy, corrosive fatigue of someone burying a terrible secret for entirely too long. You don't know what you're walking into, she whispered, her voice dropping. Dugan isn't a street thug. He doesn't scream or threaten people. He smiles. He makes you feel like you are the absolute center of the universe. And the second he extracts what he wants from you, he forgets you exist. He just moves on to the next girl to fill a hole he can't ever close. You've watched it happen. I've watched enough. She dropped her arms, the defensive posture crumbling. I've seen young, naive girls walk into his parties, thinking they were making connections. I watched them go into the private rooms, and I watched them not come out. Then why are you still cashing his checks? Delia let out a bitter, hollow laugh. Because he pays triple my standard rate. Because I have a commercial lease, a payroll to meet, and a life to maintain. Because I convinced myself I was just pouring champagne, and whatever happened after the trays were cleared wasn't my problem. But you knew. I knew, she said, staring out the glass at the smaller outbuilding. I knew the very first time. And I kept my mouth shut. Because I told myself someone else would handle it. She turned back to Bodirt, her face stripped of its sharp edges, leaving only a profound, suffocating shame. He's not here, she said quietly. He left yesterday. Said he had a special event out of town that required advanced preparation. He never says where. When is he back? I don't know. A few days. He comes and goes. I'm just the caterer. She walked to the hallway door and held it open. You have to leave. If he finds out you were here asking about his guests, it won't just be my contract on the line. Bodirt walked toward the door, stopping right on the threshold. If you hear from him, if you see Chloe, you call me. He pulled Revis's blank business card from his pocket, wrote his own cell number on the back, and handed it to her. You make the call, Delia. Maybe you can finally sleep through the night. She took the card, her fingers trembling slightly, and slipped it into her pocket. He's planning something, she blurted out, the words rushing out of her. It's different this time. He's vibrating with it. Like a kid. He's been ordering bizarre things. Custom items he's never requested before. What kind of items? She shook her head. I don't know the details. I don't want to know. I just. She looked up at his face. Find that girl. Find her before he comes back and throws whatever sick event he's building toward. Get her out before she becomes a permanent fixture. Bodirt walked out of the heavy front door, crossing the flagstone courtyard past the algae-stained fountain. He climbed into the sweltering cab of the Ford, fired the engine, and rolled back down the Royal Palm driveway. The guard at the main gate didn't even look up as he exited Elysian Estates and hit the highway. Bodirt pressed the accelerator, watching the oppressive island fortress shrink in the rearview mirror. Somewhere out there, Harry Dugan was meticulously preparing his masterpiece, and Bodirt was rapidly running out of time to crash the party. Chapter 8. The aluminum skin of the Airstream caught the last dying light of the day, shifting from burnt orange to the deep, heavy purple of a week-old bruise. Bodirt parked the Ford beside the concrete slab, killed the struggling engine, and sat with his hands resting on the steering wheel. His shoulders throbbed. His eyes burned from hours of tracking dead ends, squinting at wrought iron gates and staring down lies told behind high stucco walls. He grabbed the heavy bottle of unlabeled whiskey off the passenger seat, scooped up the disposable camera from the center console, and snagged the battered photograph of Chloe Wembley from the dashboard. The whiskey bottle was warm, slick with condensation. He still hadn't cracked the seal. He carried his haul inside, dumping it onto the fold-down table next to his disassembled Sig Sauer and the framed zoning violation. He placed Chloe's picture right in the center. She stared up at him, her smile wide and painfully naive. The weather radio crackled from the kitchenette. A tinny, automated female voice droned on about barometric pressure drops, wind shear, and the mathematical probability of a Gulf system developing over the next 72 hours. The tropical depression had a name now. Bodirt hadn't caught it. He didn't care. Naming storms felt like a waste of breath. He poured a glass of tap water and drank it standing at the narrow sink, watching the light bleed out of the sky through the small window above the counter. The concrete slab outside was completely bare. The neighboring lot where Marta's house used to stand was swallowed by shadows. The whole block felt dead, nothing but sand, aggressive scrub, and the black silhouettes of palmetto fronds trembling in the rising wind. He knew he should call Patricia Wembley. Give her a status update. Tell her he had a name, a location, and a confirmed pattern. Give the woman something to help her sleep tonight. But he didn't pick up the phone. He had a name, Harry P. Dugan, and an island fortress with an electrified gate, and a terrified caterer who knew where the bodies were buried but wouldn't dig them up. He had a storage unit with 9 photographs and 7 polished cufflinks. And he had a ticking clock that was getting louder by the hour. 3 sharp, percussive raps hit the aluminum door. Cop knocks. Bodirt knew the rhythm. It wasn't a neighbor, and it wasn't a desperate client waving a stack of hundreds. It was someone who expected the door to open immediately. Bodirt picked up the cig, checked the chamber, and set it back on the table within easy reach. He walked to the door and looked through the small, reinforced window. An unmarked sedan sat idling in the sand where the driveway used to be, its headlights boring twin tunnels through the dusk. A solitary figure stood on the metal step. He threw the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Detective Isabella Rivas stood on the threshold. She had shed the navy blazer. Her white sleeves were rolled past her elbows, and she had let her dark hair down from the severe bun she wore at the precinct. Stripped of the office armor, she looked younger and infinitely more exhausted. The shadows beneath her eyes were stark in the fading light. She held a thick manila folder in one hand. The edges of the cardboard were soft and frayed from constant handling. Her eyes tracked from the cig on the table to Bodirt's face, and finally settled on the photograph of Chloe Wembley propped against the wall. "You mind if I come in?" she asked. "You mind if I ask why?" She tapped the folder against her leg. "Off the record." Bodirt stepped back and let her pass. She ducked under the low doorframe and stood in the cramped space between the kitchenette and the table. She took in the claustrophobic reality of his life, the gun, the whiskey, the weather radio rattling off doom, and the empty concrete slab visible through the window. "You live here," she stated, making it a fact, not a question. "I live here." She gestured toward the window. "This was your place. Before the hurricane. It was my wife's place. Before the divorce. Then the hurricane. He closed the door and leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. You want to tell me why you burned gas, driving all the way out here, detective? You didn't leave your jurisdiction to critique my interior design. Rivas dropped the heavy folder onto the table next to the photograph. She didn't bother looking for a chair. She stood rigid, assuming the same defensive posture Delia had taken in Dugan's sunroom, but Rivas wasn't hiding shame. She was calculating exactly how much leverage to give away. I pulled the Wembley file 30 seconds after you walked out of my lobby, she said. Then I pulled the rest. Every missing persons report, matching the victimology from the last 3 years. The Sarah Keene file. The Maria Santos file. All of them. I pulled them, and I read them until the words blurred. She snapped the folder open and pulled out a stack of glossies, spreading them across the small table like a tarot reading. Bodirt recognized the faces instantly. They were the exact same women from the storage unit wall. Sarah Keene. Maria Santos. 7 others. 9 faces, 9 names, and 9 dates scrawled on the back of the photos in Rivas's tight, aggressive handwriting. I've been building this specific case for 6 months, she said, her voice dropping to a low simmer. 6 months of burning my nights and weekends. 6 months of fighting neighboring departments to share jurisdiction. 6 months of standing in my captain's office, watching him tell me to focus on actual homicides while the list just kept getting longer. She picked up the photo of Sarah Keene, 23 years old. Disappeared walking to her car after a shift at the Crab Pot on February 16th. Last seen getting into a dark sedan with a well-dressed man who smiled a lot. She dropped it and picked up another. Maria Santos, 19. Disappeared from a bus stop. Same suspect description. Same car. She went through the stack face by face. Each one was a fractured story, locking into a brutal pattern. Brown hair. Shy smiles. The aesthetic, the profile labeled the girl next door. The ones who blended into the background. The ones who didn't register until their faces ended up on a missing poster. The pattern is rock solid, Rivas said. The ages fluctuate between 17 and 24, but the physical type never wavers. And they vanish on Fridays. Party night. She picked up Chloe's school picture. Chloe fits the profile perfectly. She's younger than his usual demographic, but the aesthetics match. And she disappeared last Friday. Bodirt looked at the array of faces covering his table. You already knew this. 6 months ago. I knew the pattern. I didn't have a shred of physical evidence linking a suspect. I had a theory, a corkboard full of string, and a captain telling me to stop wasting the county's time. I had 9 missing women, 0 bodies, and no cooperative witnesses. She tapped the manila folder. What I didn't have was a climate-controlled storage unit. I didn't have a shrine. I didn't have the timeline written out in the killer's own handwriting. She met his gaze, the professional mask completely gone. She was a cop who had waited half a year for someone to break the rules so she could finally do her job. You found it, she said. You snapped the lock, walked inside, and documented the scene. You did exactly what I'm sworn not to do. And now you're sitting on a mountain of evidence that I legally cannot touch, obtained by a man I should have put in handcuffs this afternoon. So why aren't you reading me my rights? Rivas dragged the folding chair out from the corner and sat down, her knees nearly touching the table. She rested her hands flat against the scattered photographs. Because you were right. The clock is running out, and the gap between the abductions is collapsing. She tapped Chloe's photo. The first gap was 4 months. Then 3. Then 2. Then 1. It's been 3 days since Chloe Wembley vanished. 3 days, and her Polaroid is already on the wall. The cufflinks are waiting in the case. He's accelerating. She looked up at Bodirt, the exhaustion in her eyes replaced by cold urgency. He's preparing for something massive. When he's done preparing, Chloe officially becomes victim number 8. And then there's absolutely nothing left to find except another faded picture on a corrugated steel wall. So you're not arresting me. I'm using you. Off the record. Completely unofficial. She reached into the folder, pulled out a single sheet of printer paper, and slid it across the table. Because I need you to find this girl before my department finishes debating whether she's a runaway. Bodirt picked up the paper. It held an address. A rural road he didn't recognize. A plot on the map, surrounded by nothing but green agricultural zones. Harry Dugan owns a secondary property, Rivas explained. 10 acres out near the sugarcane fields. No neighbors for a 5-mile radius. He bought it through a Shell LLC 6 years ago, right after he settled that massive civil suit. The island house is for show. The rural property is where he does his real work. You think he's holding Chloe there? It's remote, it's heavily secured, and it's his. And it is the one place I cannot get a judge to sign a warrant for without establishing hard probable cause. Every time I ask, my captain demands a body. Rivas stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floorboards. She walked to the door, resting her hand on the latch, her back rigid. I'm handing you everything I have, Bohannon. The address, the name, the history. I'm handing you 6 months of dead-end police work. I need you to go out there and find me something clean. Something I can actually drop on my captain's desk to force his hand and secure a raid. She looked back at him over her shoulder. The warning in her eyes was unmistakable. But we are going to be explicitly clear about the rules of engagement. If you go out there and you find Dugan, you do not touch him. You do not lay a hand on that man. You call me, and you let me do my job. If you let your fuse burn down, if you beat him into a coma in the dirt, this entire case evaporates. The evidence gets poisoned. The girl becomes a footnote in a media circus about a rogue ex-cop who snapped. Do you understand me? Bodirt looked at the cig resting on the table, then at the photograph of Chloe Wembley. He looked at the exhausted, furious detective standing in his doorway, risking her entire career on a man they both knew was a loaded gun. I understand, Bodirt said. She held his gaze for a long moment, evaluating the lie, before pulling the door open and stepping out into the muggy dusk. The unmarked sedan's engine flared to life. The headlights swept across the concrete slab as Rivas pulled away, her taillights shrinking into the dark as she headed back to the highway. Bodirt stood in the doorway and watched her go. The weather radio droned on behind him, tracking a storm that was gathering strength over warm Gulf waters. He walked back inside and picked up the printed address. A house surrounded by sugarcane. A man who collected lives like jewelry. He looked at the face of a 14-year-old girl who didn't know how to be afraid yet. Tomorrow, he said quietly to the empty trailer. He reached over and snapped the weather radio off. The sudden silence was heavy, pressing hard against the thin aluminum walls. He sat down in the dark, the cig within arm's reach, and waited for the sun to come up. Chapter 9. The kayak cut a sharp line through the black water. Mangroves crowded the narrow channel on both sides, their tangled roots forming a dense canopy that completely blocked out the sky. Bodirt paddled with long, punishing strokes. His arms burned and his shoulders screamed, but he welcomed the physical pain. It was a clean, sharp distraction from the heavy weight of the photographs burning a hole in his jacket pocket. He hadn't slept a wink in the airstream. He had stared at the aluminum ceiling until 4 in the morning, the address Rivas gave him folded over his chest, listening to the weather radio predict a storm he already knew was coming. Finally, he had pulled on his boots, driven his rusted Ford straight east to the coast, and borrowed a boat from the racks without asking. He needed to move. He needed the water. And he needed the only person on Earth who had ever been able to make him see straight. Marta's business sat at the dead end of a dirt road, terminating at the Intracoastal Waterway. It was a collection of heavily weathered buildings that had functioned as a commercial fish camp decades ago. A hand-painted sign hung above the main cabin, its letters peeling in the salt air, Mangrove Eco Tours. The sun wasn't up yet, but the sky had bled from pitch black to a bruised thin gray. Bodirt dug the paddle in, bringing the kayak around in a tight arc toward the wooden dock. He glided in silently. Marta was already there, her back to the water, adjusting the nylon straps on a stack of rental kayaks. She wore a wide-brimmed canvas hat and a long-sleeved shirt stained the color of weak coffee. Her hair was silver now, catching the flat early light, having lost the rich brown he remembered from their 12 years together. She didn't turn when the kayak bumped the pilings. She didn't turn when Bodirt pulled himself up, his heavy boots thudding against the damp wooden planks, casting a long shadow across her work area. "You're early," she said, pulling a strap tight. "I don't open for an hour. I'm not here to look at manatees." Marta finished the knot, straightened her spine, and finally turned around. It was the same face he had woken up to for over a decade, but the geography had shifted. The lines framing her eyes had deepened, etched there by years of squinting across the glare of the estuary, tracking ospreys and shifting tides. Her eyes were the exact color of the intracoastal water behind her. Gray-green, completely flat, giving absolutely nothing away. "John." "Marta." She looked at him with the same careful, practiced neutrality she had worn the night she handed him the divorce papers and told him where to sign. A solid brick wall built slowly over years of things left deliberately unsaid. "You look like hell," she said. "I feel like hell." "That isn't news." She stepped past him off the dock, wiping her hands on her canvas shorts. "Come inside. I have coffee. It won't fix your face, but it might wake you up." He followed her across the sand, walking past the fading signs listing tour times and local wildlife. The main building was a relic from the 1940s, built back when this stretch of the coast belonged to poachers and rum runners instead of real estate developers. Knotty pine walls, wide plank oak floors, and large windows looking out over the water. Marta had installed a commercial counter and a rack of environmental brochures, but the heavy bones of the place still belonged to her grandfather. She poured coffee from a heavily calcified machine and slid a chipped ceramic mug across the counter. She leaned against the back counter, cradling her own cup in both hands. "Talk," she ordered. Bodirt sat on a wooden stool, letting the heat of the mug seep into his palms. The coffee was bitter and aggressively strong. He looked out the window. The light was fully breaking now, turning the sky a pale, sickly yellow. "I'm working a case," Bodirt said. "Missing girl. 14 years old. Chloe Wembley. Disappeared 3 days ago. County Mounties wrote her off as a runaway. Her mother paid me to look harder." Marta took a slow sip, her eyes locked on his face. And I broke a lock last night. Found a storage unit. Found a wall of photographs. 9 girls, all fitting a highly specific profile. Brown hair. Shy. The girls who trust the wrong people because nobody taught them otherwise. The final photograph in the grid is Chloe. The date written underneath is the exact day she went missing. He reached into his damp jacket, pulled out the glossy school photo Patricia Wembley had given him, and laid it flat on the oak counter. Marta didn't touch it. She just looked at it. Her fingers tightened around her coffee mug. "The man who took her is named Harry Dugan," Bodirt continued. "He runs high-end private parties. Isolates girls who fit his aesthetic, makes them feel like the center of the universe, and then they vanish. The gaps between his abductions are collapsing. He's accelerating. Marta set her mug down. When she finally spoke, the defensive wall in her voice showed a hairline fracture. She looks like she believes every word you tell her, Marta said quietly, staring at Chloe's freckled face. Like she hasn't learned that people lie for a living. That's his specific target. He hunts for the shine. Marta pushed the photograph back across the counter. Her hand was perfectly steady, but the gray-green in her eyes was churning. Why are you standing in my kitchen, John? You didn't drive out here before dawn, steal my boat, and paddle yourself into exhaustion just to show me a picture of a missing teenager. Bodirt looked down at his black coffee. Steam curled off the surface and vanished into the air-conditioned room. I have his address. A fortified rural property out near the sugarcane fields. No neighbors. He's planning a massive event out there. A party. So go do your job. Find him. The wall slammed back into place. Her voice went entirely flat. You don't need my permission. You never asked for my permission when we were married. I'm not asking for a hall pass. Then what exactly are you asking for? He looked at her. Really looked at her, taking in the silver hair and the slight permanent slump of her shoulders. She looked like a woman who had carried something impossibly heavy for years and finally just dropped it in the dirt. I need you to tell me I'm not a maniac, Bodirt said. I need you to look at me and tell me that getting this girl out of that house is worth whatever violent, ugly things I'm going to have to do to make it happen. Marta stared at him. For 10 agonizing seconds, the silence in the cabin was absolute. You think I don't follow your career? She asked, her voice tight. I read the local papers, John. I see the stories about the men you track down. I hear the whispers about the pieces you leave behind in parking lots. When I married you, you were a man who stood directly between innocent people and the monsters trying to hurt them. You came home at night, and you told me about the lives you saved. She stood up, walked to the large window, and looked out at the intracoastal. The water was glittering now, birds diving for the morning feed. And then you changed. Or maybe you didn't change at all. Maybe you just stopped hiding the violence. You stopped solving cases and started punishing people. When they finally stripped your badge, I thought you would hit bottom and wake up. I thought my husband would come back. She turned around, crossing her arms over her chest, her face half in shadow. But you didn't stop. You just kept breaking men, completely unchecked. I couldn't stand in the kitchen and watch you turn into the exact thing you used to hunt. That's why I left. Bodirt sat perfectly still. The coffee in his mug had gone cold. You think I'm the monster. I think you're a man who spent his entire adult life fighting in the dark, and somewhere along the line, you lost the ability to tell the difference between justice and rage. She walked back to the counter and sat on the stool right beside him. But I also think you are the only human being on this coast capable of ripping that girl out of that house. She reached out and placed her hand flat over his. Her palm was rough, calloused from heavy paddles and salt water. You are going to find him, John. And when you have him cornered, you are going to have to make a choice. Are you going to be the detective who saves her life, or are you going to be the wrecking ball that destroys everything in the room to satisfy an itch? Because only one of those men actually brings her home. She stood up and walked to the front door, pulling it open. The coastal heat spilled inside, carrying the heavy scent of blooming mangroves. You want to catch a man like that, you have to dissect his process, Marta said, holding the door. He doesn't use physical force. He uses psychological gravity. He makes people want to stay in his orbit. He makes them feel special until he discards them. That's how he's operated this long without triggering tripwires. Bodirt stood up, the wooden stool scraping loudly across the oak floor. How do I corner a guy who makes everyone look the other way? You don't hunt him, Marta said. You hunt his periphery. You find the person standing just outside the spotlight. The one who sees the monster but is too compromised to leave. You find the accomplice waiting for an excuse to stop pretending. Bodirt stopped dead in his tracks. Delia. The caterer. The woman standing barefoot on Dugan's marble floor, burying her own shame under a mountain of Blue Lagoon invoices. He stepped through the doorway, out into the blinding morning sun. John, Marta called out. He stopped and looked back. She stood in the doorway, framed by the shadows of the old fish camp. When you get her back, Marta said, come sit on my dock. Just watch the water. The water doesn't lie, and it doesn't judge. It just keeps moving forward. Find your way back to yourself. She closed the door. The heavy click of the latch sounded incredibly final. Bodirt walked across the sand to the ford. He climbed inside, tossing the photograph of Chloe Wembley onto the passenger seat next to Revis's business card. He jammed the keys into the ignition, the engine roaring to life. Marta was right. He couldn't assault Dugan's fortress blind. He needed the blueprint. He needed the exact layout of the trap before the steel jaws snapped shut. He threw the truck into gear and tore out of the gravel lot, heading back toward the island. He was going to find the woman who poured the champagne, and he was going to squeeze her until she broke. Chapter 10. Blue Lagoon Catering operated out of a tilt-up concrete warehouse in a sprawling industrial park near the airport. The area was a grid of flat roofs, loading docks, and cracked asphalt shimmering under the midday sun. There were no royal palms here. No marble statues spilling water into algae-stained basins. Just the heavy, pragmatic machinery of the city, keeping the wealthy enclaves across the bridge fed and entertained. Bodirt parked the Ford between two white box trucks bearing the Diving Woman logo. The heat radiating off the asphalt was intense enough to warp the horizon line. He stepped out, ignoring the ache in his shoulders from the morning's kayak row, and walked up the concrete ramp to the open loading bay. The transition from the dead, humid exterior to the interior of the commercial kitchen was violent. The air inside was a chaotic collision of roasting garlic, industrial degreaser, and the sharp tang of citrus. Stainless steel prep tables stretched the length of the room beneath banks of harsh fluorescent tubes. A dozen cooks, in white coats and hairnets, moved with frantic, orchestrated precision, shouting to each other in rapid-fire Spanish over the roar of heavy-duty ventilation hoods. Bodirt walked right past a kid washing down rubber floor mats with a high-pressure hose. Nobody stopped him. In a kitchen running this hot, anyone who walked with enough absolute purpose was assumed to be the health inspector or the guy fixing the freezer. He found Delia at the far end of the room, standing before a massive steel prep counter. She wore the same cargo shorts and tank top from yesterday, a white apron tied tight around her waist. She was aggressively stabbing a clipboard with a ballpoint pen, auditing a tray of miniature crab cakes while simultaneously yelling at a sous chef about supply chain failures. Bodirt stopped on the opposite side of the steel table. Delia looked up. The pen froze in her hand. For a split second, her eyes widened in pure panic, anticipating that Harry Dugan had sent someone to collect her. When she registered Bodirt's face, the fear curdled instantly into fury. "Are you completely out of your mind?" she hissed, dropping her voice to avoid carrying over the exhaust fans. "I told you to stay away from me. If one of my staff mentions you were here." "We need to talk," Bodirt said. "Somewhere without an audience. I have a 300-plate charity dinner loading out in 40 minutes. I don't have time to entertain a rogue private investigator." "You'll make time." Or I can stand right here and ask you how much Dugan pays you to look the other way while he locks teenagers in soundproof rooms." Delia's face went chalk white beneath the harsh lighting. She glanced frantically at the sous chef, who was deeply absorbed in shouting at a line cook. She slammed the clipboard down onto the stainless steel, wiped her hands on her apron, and marched toward a heavy steel door at the back of the kitchen. Bodirt followed her. She yanked the heavy handle and stepped inside. Bodirt moved in right behind her, pulling the door shut until the latch engaged with a heavy, final thud. The roar of the kitchen vanished instantly, replaced by the mechanical drone of massive condenser fans. They were standing inside a commercial walk-in cooler. The air was bone-chillingly cold, 34 degrees of manufactured winter. Stacks of waxed cardboard boxes lined the metal wire shelves, crates of imported produce, prime cuts of meat wrapped in butcher paper, and plastic tubs of prepped garnishes. Delia crossed her arms over her chest, shivering immediately. "You have 2 minutes. Before I call the police." "You aren't calling anyone," Bodirt said. "I found a storage unit out past the agricultural land yesterday. Rented under a shell company." I popped the lock and walked inside. The AC was running full blast, keeping it exactly this cold. Delia stared at a stack of bell peppers, refusing to meet his eyes. "He hung Polaroids on the wall, Delia. 9 of them. A timeline of every girl he's taken over the last 2 years. Chloe Wembley is sitting right in the center. The date written underneath her face is 3 days old. There's a velvet chair facing the wall, and a glass case with 7 cufflinks sitting on a shelf. He's building a shrine to his own sickness, and he's using your catering trucks for cover. I don't know anything about a storage unit." Her voice trembled, the words misting in the freezing air. "No, you just know about the parties. You bring the top-shelf liquor and the hors d'oeuvres. You set the stage. You make his rural compound look like a high-society event, so the girls feel safe walking through the front door." Bodirt took a deliberate step closer. "You are bringing the food to the funeral before the victim is even dead. Stop it." She pressed her hands over her ears, her eyes squeezed shut. "Stop saying that." "I'm not going to stop. Dugan doesn't operate in a vacuum. He operates because people like you take his cash and pretend he's just an eccentric client. You are part of the machine." "I didn't take them," Delia yelled, dropping her hands, her eyes wide and terrified. "I just poured the drinks. He told me they were escorts. He told me they were professionals who knew exactly what they were signing up for." Chloe Wembley is a 14-year-old girl who likes watching Dateline with her mother on Friday nights. "Does she look like a professional to you?" Delia crumpled. She leaned back against the wire shelving, sliding down until she was sitting on an overturned milk crate. She buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook, the cold and the guilt finally breaking through the defensive wall she had spent 2 years maintaining. Bodirt stood over her, letting the silence stretch. He didn't offer comfort. He wasn't there to offer absolution. "I have the address of the property out in the cane fields," Bodirt said quietly. "But I don't know the layout. If I go in blind, I make noise. If I make noise, Dugan has time to panic. And guys like Dugan don't leave witnesses when they panic." Delia slowly lowered her hands. Her face was tear-streaked and red from the cold. "He'll kill me," she whispered. "If he knows I gave you the blueprint, he will absolutely ruin me. And then he will kill me." "He's not going to know you talked," Bodirt said. "Because after I walk out of this cooler, you are going to send your staff home. You are going to lock the doors to this warehouse, drive home, pack a bag, and leave the county for the weekend. Check into a motel in Orlando under a fake name and watch the Weather Channel." She looked up at him, studying his face. She was looking for a guarantee he couldn't actually give her, but she desperately needed to believe it anyway. Delia stood up. She reached into her apron pocket, pulled out a black Sharpie, and grabbed a flattened wax paper produce box off the bottom shelf. She smoothed the cardboard out on top of a stack of crates and began drawing with rapid, shaking strokes. "The rural property is 10 acres, she said, her voice dropping into the pragmatic, flat tone of a logistician. High chain-link fence, barbed wire at the top. The main gate is heavy-gauge steel. The keypad code is 4491. It changes monthly, but that's the code I used for the delivery last week." Bodirt memorized the numbers instantly. Delia drew a large rectangle in the center of the cardboard. "The main house is a single-story ranch. Open floor plan. That's where he hosts the main party. But he doesn't keep them there." She moved the Sharpie to the top right corner of the sketch, drawing a smaller, separate square. "There's a detached guest house 70 yards behind the main building, completely hidden by a line of cypress trees. It used to be a caretaker's cottage. 2 years ago, Dugan brought in a private contracting crew from out of state. They excavated beneath the cottage. They told me they were building a subterranean climate-controlled wine cellar." "It isn't a wine cellar." "No," Delia said, tracing a heavy black X over the smaller square. "There's a reinforced steel door in the floor of the guesthouse living room. It requires a biometric thumbprint to open. I saw it once, accidentally, when I brought a tray of glasses out back. The stairs go straight down into the earth. That's where he takes them when the party is over." She dropped the Sharpie. It clattered against the wire shelf. "He has cameras mounted on the front gate and the 4 corners of the main house," she added, her arms wrapping tight around her torso again. "But the guest house is a blind spot. He doesn't want digital records of who goes in or out of that building." Bodirt picked up the flattened cardboard box and folded it in half, tucking it into his jacket. "Are there armed guards?" "No guards. Dugan hates having other men around his property. He thinks it ruins the aesthetic. He relies entirely on the isolation and the steel doors." Bodirt nodded. It was exactly what Marta had predicted. Dugan relied on psychological gravity and isolation, not hired muscle. It was a massive vulnerability if someone actually knew where to look. He reached for the heavy door handle, then stopped and looked back at Delia. She looked incredibly small, standing in the freezing artificial winter, surrounded by the physical evidence of a life built on a foundation of brutal compromises. "Go to Orlando, Delia," Bodirt said. "Don't answer unknown numbers. Don't check your email. Just disappear for 3 days." "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to crash a party." Bodirt pushed the heavy steel door open, stepping out of the freezing cooler and back into the chaotic heat of the commercial kitchen. He didn't look back. He navigated the maze of stainless steel tables, the shouting cooks, and the roaring exhaust fans, pushing his way through the loading dock doors and back out into the blistering parking lot. The Ford was an oven. Bodirt slid behind the wheel, ignoring the burning vinyl against his back, and pulled the folded wax cardboard from his jacket. He traced the heavy black X with his thumb. 4491. A biometric lock. A subterranean room. He shoved the map into the passenger seat, cranked the engine, and threw the truck into gear. The skies to the south were beginning to curdle into heavy, dark, bruised clouds. The pressure was dropping. The storm was finally moving in off the water, and Bodirt was driving right into the teeth of it. Chapter 11. The weather radio finally got it right. The sky tore open 10 miles west of the turnpike. It wasn't a standard afternoon shower. It was a solid, suffocating sheet of water driven sideways by 30-mile-an-hour gusts. The bruised clouds swallowed the sun entirely, plunging the Everglades agricultural area into a premature, violent twilight. The wind hammered the sugarcane fields, flattening the tall stalks into a churning green ocean. Bodirt fought the Ford steering wheel, keeping the tires from washing out on the slick asphalt. The windshield wipers were on their highest setting, thrashing back and forth, completely useless against the deluge. He didn't mind the weather. The storm was a shield. The torrential rain would blind the perimeter cameras, drown out the sound of the truck's failing muffler, and wash away his footprints the second he lifted his boots from the mud. He found the turnoff Delia had marked on her wax paper map. It was barely a road, just a narrow cut of crushed limestone leading away from the county highway, disappearing into a dense wall of Australian pines. Bodirt killed the headlights. He drove by feel, and the faint ambient glow of the storm, the heavy truck creeping over the ruts. A quarter-mile down, the tree line broke. Dugan's compound sat isolated in the center of the acreage. A 10-foot chain-link fence surrounded the property, topped with 3 strands of razor wire that gleamed slick and silver in the rain. The main gate was heavy-gauge steel, set between 2 concrete pillars. A keypad glowed faintly on a stanchion beside the entrance. A dome camera was mounted above it, its lens streaked and blurred by the driving rain. Bodirt eased the Ford onto the shoulder, 50 yards shy of the gate. He shoved it into park, leaving the engine running, and stepped out into the maelstrom. The rain hit him like a physical weight, instantly soaking through his canvas jacket and plastering his hair to his skull. He pulled his collar up, ducked his head, and jogged toward the gate. The mud sucked at his boots, trying to drag him down. He reached the stanchion, shielding the keypad with his body. He punched in the numbers Delia had given him. 4491. A heavy, metallic clank echoed over the roar of the wind. The magnetic lock disengaged. The steel gates slowly groaned inward, the motorized hinges fighting the wind. Bodirt sprinted back to the truck. He dropped it into gear, rolled through the open gates, and immediately veered off the paved driveway. He drove the Ford deep into a thicket of overgrown palmettos near the fence line, effectively burying the rusted truck in the brush. He cut the engine. He drew the Sig Sauer from his shoulder holster, racked the slide to chamber a round, and stepped back out into the storm. Through the curtain of rain, the main house sat like a massive dark monument. Delia had drawn it accurately, a single-story ranch, sprawling and modern, its large windows pitch black. Dugan was either conserving power or he wasn't inside. Bodirt didn't care about the main house. He cared about the blind spot. He moved in a wide arc, sticking to the edge of the property, giving the corners of the main house a wide berth to avoid the camera sightlines. The wind howled through the cypress trees, a high, desperate sound that masked his approach. He wiped the water from his eyes, scanning the darkness. There, 70 yards behind the main structure, completely obscured by a natural wall of old-growth cypress, stood the caretaker's cottage. It was a modest wood-frame building, its white paint peeling, a small front porch sagging under the weight of the water. No lights. No cameras. Exactly as the caterer had promised. Bodirt crossed the open ground in a low, fast sprint. He hit the porch, his boots making no sound over the drumming rain on the tin roof, and pressed his back against the siding beside the front door. He reached out and tried the knob. Locked. He didn't bother with the lock picks. His hands were too cold, and the storm provided all the acoustic cover he needed. He stepped back, raised his right boot, and drove his heel squarely into the space right next to the deadbolt. The wood splintered with a sharp crack. The door flew open, crashing against the interior wall. Bodirt went in low, the Sig leading the way. The cottage smelled of stale air, dust, and old pine. He swept the beam of a small tactical flashlight across the room. It was sparsely furnished. A faded floral sofa, a cheap coffee table, a kitchenette covered in a thin layer of grime. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to be, an abandoned outbuilding. But the air felt wrong. The cottage was dusty, but the dust on the floorboards was disturbed. A wide, clean path led directly from the front door to the center of the living room, stopping at a large braided rug. Bodirt walked over and kicked the rug aside. The floorboards beneath it were not wood. They were a solid, seamless square of reinforced steel, sitting perfectly flush with the foundation. He knelt down, playing the flashlight over the metal. There were no hinges visible on the surface. No handle to pull. In the top right corner of the steel plate, a small recessed square of black glass sat dark and dormant. The biometric scanner. Bodirt pressed his palm flat against the cold steel. He couldn't hear anything beneath the floor. No hum of an AC unit, no voices, no crying. The subterranean room was a vault, completely sealed off from the world above. A profound, helpless frustration tightened his chest. He had found the cage, but the keys were grafted to the hands of a monster who wasn't here. He couldn't pry the door open. He couldn't shoot the lock. A bullet would just shatter the scanner and permanently seal the electronic latch, trapping Chloe underneath with a dwindling oxygen supply. He needed Harry Dugan. He needed the man's thumb pressed against that glass. Bodirt stood up. He clicked the flashlight off, plunging the cottage back into darkness. He retreated to the far corner of the room, pulling a heavy wooden dining chair away from the wall. He positioned it in the shadows, giving himself a clear, unobstructed view of the front door and the steel hatch in the floor. He sat down. The rain continued to hammer the tin roof. The cottage groaned under the wind shear. Bodirt rested the cig on his thigh. His clothes were soaked through, chilling him to the bone, but his hands were perfectly steady. He didn't check his watch. Time didn't matter anymore. Rivas was sitting at her desk, waiting for a phone call that would give her the legal right to raid the property. Patricia Wembley was sitting by her phone, praying her daughter would walk through the front door. Bodirt was done waiting for the law, and he was out of prayers. He closed his eyes, listening to the rhythm of the storm, dialing in his focus. He let the cold seep in. He let his heart rate slow down to a steady, predatory crawl. 20 minutes passed. Maybe an hour. Then the sound changed. It was faint at first, easily dismissed as a trick of the wind, but Bodirt's ears picked up the mechanical frequency instantly. A heavy engine, laboring in the mud. He opened his eyes. A sweep of white headlights cut through the driving rain, illuminating the dense wall of cypress trees outside the shattered front door. The vehicle stopped somewhere near the main house. A car door slammed shut, the sound carrying cleanly through the wet air. Bodirt thumbed the safety off the cig. The mechanical click was loud in the dark room. Footsteps approached. Heavy, deliberate, squelching in the mud, moving directly toward the caretaker's cottage. Harry Dugan had come home to check on his collection. Chapter 12. The heavy squelch of footsteps stopped at the edge of the sagging wooden porch. From his chair in the shadows, Bodirt watched the silhouette of a man step up into the shallow overhang, out of the punishing rain. Harry Dugan didn't rush. He didn't scramble for cover like a normal person caught in a tropical deluge. He moved with a terrifying, unhurried grace. Dugan reached into the pocket of a sleek, charcoal gray raincoat and pulled out a keyring. He stepped toward the door. He stopped completely still. He saw the splintered wood where Bodirt's boot had shattered the doorframe. He didn't gasp. He didn't drop his keys. His posture simply locked, the relaxed lines of his shoulders instantly going rigid. He slowly lowered the keys and reached his empty right hand inside his coat. "Take your hand out of the coat," Bodirt said. His voice didn't carry over the storm outside, but in the dead, dusty air of the cottage, it cracked like a whip. Dugan froze. He slowly turned his head, staring into the pitch-black corner where Bodirt sat. He couldn't see the Sig Sauer leveled at his chest, but he didn't need to. The tone of Bodirt's voice conveyed all the necessary ballistics. Dugan withdrew his hand, keeping his fingers spread and visible. He took a single step into the room. "I don't keep cash on the property," Dugan said. His voice was a rich, cultivated baritone. Smooth, warm, and entirely devoid of panic. "If you're looking for art or jewelry, you've broken into the wrong building. The main house is heavily alarmed. Shut the door." Dugan hesitated for a fraction of a second, then pushed the splintered door until it jammed into the broken frame, cutting off the worst of the wind. Bodirt stood up. He clicked his tactical flashlight on, pointing the beam at the floorboards so it splashed upward, illuminating Dugan without blinding him. Wade Crawley had been right. Dugan was handsome, in the way a high-end mannequin was handsome. Symmetrical features, silver hair perfectly styled despite the humidity, and skin that looked expensive. But his eyes were completely dead. Flat, dark glass reflecting the flashlight beam, showing absolutely nothing operating underneath. Dugan looked at Bodirt's soaked jacket, the heavy boots, and the Sig Sauer held with practiced steady ease. The calculation in his dark eyes shifted. "You aren't a burglar," Dugan said smoothly. "You're a professional. Which means you're either here to kill me, or you're here to negotiate. If it's a contract, whoever hired you can be outbid. Tell me your price." Bodirt closed the distance between them. He stopped just outside of arm's reach. "Chloe Wembley," Bodirt said. For the first time, a microscopic crack appeared in Dugan's flawless veneer. His jaw tightened. The muscles in his neck twitched. "I don't know who that is," Dugan said. 14 years old. Brown hair. Freckles. You picked her up on Friday. You've had her locked in a box beneath this floor for 3 days while you set up the catering for your little party." Dugan recovered quickly, the mask slipping right back into place. He let out a soft, patronizing sigh. "You must be the private investigator the mother hired. Bohannon, isn't it? The disgraced deputy. Listen to me, John. You've made a terrible mistake. You've trespassed onto private property, destroyed a door, and you're pointing a firearm at an unarmed man. You leave right now, and I won't press charges. I won't even call the police." "You aren't going to call the police because your thumb is going to be busy," Bodirt said. He gestured toward the center of the room with the barrel of the cig. "Walk." Dugan looked at the braided rug, kicked to the side, exposing the square of reinforced steel. He didn't move. "I strongly suggest we sit down and discuss this rationally," Dugan said, his voice dropping into that hypnotic, gravitational hum Marta had warned about. "You think you're rescuing someone. I understand that. But you don't have the whole story. The girls who come here, they want to be here. I give them a life they could never afford. I show them what the world actually looks like from the top." He took a slow step toward Bodirt, his hands still raised, his voice vibrating with absolute conviction. "They aren't prisoners, John. They're guests. And they stay because they realize the world outside is ugly and cruel. I protect them from that. I keep them perfect." Bodirt didn't argue. He didn't debate the psychology. He stepped forward, grabbed Dugan by the lapels of his expensive raincoat, and drove him backward. Dugan hit the floor hard, the breath rushing out of his lungs in a sharp hiss. He scrambled to get his feet under him, his calm facade finally shattering, but Bodirt was already there. He planted his heavy, mud-soaked boot squarely in the center of Dugan's chest, pinning the man flat against the dusty floorboards. Bodirt leaned down, pressing the cold steel of the cig against Dugan's cheekbone. "I'm not one of your party guests," Bodirt whispered, his voice a low rasp. "And I don't give a damn about your philosophy. You're going to put your thumb on that scanner, or I'm going to blow your kneecap off, drag you over there, and press your thumb against the glass while you bleed out. Choose." Dugan stared up at him. The hypnotic charm was gone, replaced by naked, venomous hatred. He realized, with sudden and absolute clarity, that he was looking at a man who was entirely disconnected from the rules of polite society. "You're a dead man," Dugan spat. "Probably," Bodirt said. Thumb. He eased his boot off Dugan's chest, keeping the gun trained on his face. Dugan slowly rolled over. He crawled to the edge of the steel plate, his breath coming in ragged, angry bursts. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the small square of black glass. Bodirt racked the hammer of the SIG. The sharp click echoed in the small room. Dugan pressed his right thumb against the scanner. A small green LED illuminated beneath the glass. Deep beneath the floor, heavy pneumatic pistons hissed. The reinforced steel plate clunked heavily, then began to rise. It folded upward on heavy concealed hinges, swinging open like the jaws of a vault. A blast of stale, highly conditioned air rushed up from the dark, carrying the faint sterile scent of industrial cleaning supplies. A narrow concrete staircase plunged straight down into the earth, lit only by a string of dim, recessed emergency lights set into the baseboards. Bodirt grabbed Dugan by the back of his raincoat and hauled him roughly to his feet. "After you," Bodirt said. Dugan straightened his coat, his hands shaking slightly. He looked down into the subterranean dark, then back at Bodirt. "You have no idea what you're walking into. Move." Dugan began to descend the concrete stairs, his expensive shoes echoing dully in the enclosed space. Bodirt followed close behind, the SIG aimed directly at the center of Dugan's back. The air grew significantly colder as they went down. The storm raging above them was completely cut off, the roar of the rain vanishing the moment they descended below the frost line. The silence in the stairwell was absolute, pressing against Bodirt's eardrums like a physical weight. At the bottom of the stairs, a heavy steel security door blocked their path. It was institutional, devoid of any handles on the outside, controlled entirely by a keypad set into the concrete wall. "Open it," Bodirt ordered. Dugan punched a 6-digit code into the pad. The heavy deadbolts retracted with a loud, mechanical thud. Dugan pushed the door open. Bodirt shoved Dugan through the threshold and stepped in behind him, panning his tactical flashlight across the space. It wasn't a dungeon. That was the most terrifying part. It was a suite, a massive, flawlessly decorated living space built entirely underground. Thick carpets covered the floor. Expensive artwork hung on walls painted in soft, soothing pastels. A large, flat-screen television sat above a fake fireplace. It looked like a luxury hotel room, designed to completely disorient whoever was kept inside, making them forget they were buried beneath 10 acres of mud and sugarcane. But there were no windows, and there were no door handles on the inside of the heavy steel door they had just walked through. Bodirt swept the room with the beam of his flashlight, his finger tight on the trigger. The living area was empty. He pushed Dugan forward, toward a hallway that branched off toward a bedroom and a bathroom. "Chloe," Bodirt called out. His voice echoed harshly in the sterile space. "Nothing." He shoved Dugan against the wall and moved toward the bedroom door. He kicked it open, slicing the pie with his flashlight beam, clearing the corners. A 4-poster bed with a heavy duvet, a dresser, a mirrored closet. The bedroom was empty. Bodirt spun around, grabbing Dugan by the throat and slamming him back against the pastel drywall. "Where is she?" Bodirt demanded, the rage finally spiking, burning hot in his chest. "Where is the girl?" Dugan didn't fight back. Despite being pinned against the wall, a slow, terrible smile spread across his handsome face. He looked at the empty bed, then looked back at Bodirt. "I told you," Dugan whispered, his eyes gleaming in the flashlight beam. "You're too late. She wanted to go to the party." Chapter 13. Dugan's smile was a fraction of an inch wide, but it held a terrifying amount of genuine amusement. He looked entirely comfortable, pinned against the pastel drywall of the underground bedroom. "The party," Bodirt repeated softly. "It's Friday night, John. The storm is perfect cover. No helicopters in the air. No local patrols out on the rural routes. Everyone who matters arrived hours ago." Dugan tilted his chin toward the empty four-poster bed. "I don't bring the guests down here until the main event is over. You broke into an empty cage." Bodirt processed the information instantly. The cars parked near the main house. The dark windows. Dugan hadn't been conserving power. He had soundproofed the interior and blacked out the glass. Dugan shifted his weight. It was a microscopic movement, barely a twitch of his shoulder, but Bodirt felt the muscles in the man's neck bunch under his grip. Dugan's left hand slapped the wall beside the doorframe. He didn't hit a light switch. He hit a flat, flush-mounted panel, painted the exact same pastel blue as the drywall. A heavy, electronic siren blared in the hallway. "Lockdown?" Dugan whispered. 50 feet away, the massive steel security door at the entrance of the suite began to slide shut. It moved on heavy hydraulic tracks, hissing like a striking snake. If that door closed, the electronic keypad would disable. The reinforced steel floor above would drop back into place. Bodirt would be buried alive under 10 feet of dirt and concrete, and Dugan was perfectly willing to be buried with him if it meant keeping his secret intact. Bodirt didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for the override code. He dropped the cig to his side, grabbed Dugan by the lapels of his raincoat, and threw him. Dugan hit the heavy oak dresser, shattering the mirror above it, and collapsed the carpet in a tangle of expensive charcoal wool and broken glass. Bodirt sprinted out of the bedroom. The siren screamed from recessed speakers in the ceiling, a high-pitched, disorienting wail designed to induce panic. He hit the main living area. The steel door was halfway across the threshold, moving with unstoppable grinding force. Bodirt dove. He hit the carpet hard, sliding the last 5 feet on his shoulder, and jammed his heavy, mud-caked boot into the track just ahead of the sliding steel edge. The door slammed into the reinforced leather of his boot. The hydraulics whined in protest. The pressure was immense, instantly bruising the bones in Bodirt's foot, but the safety sensors registered the obstruction. The heavy door shuddered, stopped, and slowly reversed back into the concrete wall with an angry hiss. Bodirt scrambled to his feet, ignoring the throbbing pain in his ankle. He stood in the threshold, physically blocking the door from attempting another close. Footsteps rushed the hallway behind him. Dugan emerged from the bedroom, a jagged shard of mirror glass gripped tightly in his right hand. A thin line of blood ran down his cheek where he had taken a cut from the fall. The calm, untouchable architect was gone. The man lunging across the underground suite was pure, desperate violence. Dugan slashed at Bodirt's throat. Bodirt stepped inside the arc of the blade, catching Dugan's wrist with his left hand. The momentum carried them both forward, slamming hard against the steel doorframe. Dugan was stronger than he looked, fueled by the manic energy of a predator backed into a corner. He twisted his wrist, trying to drive the glass shard into Bodirt's ribs. Bodirt brought the heavy steel barrel of the cig up and drove it squarely into Dugan's temple. The dull crack of metal on bone cut right through the wailing siren. Dugan's eyes rolled back. His grip went slack. The shard of glass dropped to the carpet. He crumpled to the floor, dead weight, completely unconscious before his knees hit the ground. Bodirt leaned against the cold concrete wall, his chest heaving. The siren continued to scream. His boot throbbed. He looked down at the architect of the nightmare, bleeding onto the pristine carpet. Marta's voice echoed in his head. "Are you going to be the wrecking ball?" He wanted to put a bullet in the man's chest. He wanted to end it right here, in the buried room Dugan had built for his victims. Instead, Bodirt grabbed Dugan by the collar of his raincoat. He hauled the unconscious man over the threshold and dumped him in the bottom of the concrete stairwell. Bodirt stepped out of the suite and slapped the keypad on the wall. The heavy steel door slid shut with a final echoing boom, locking from the inside. The blaring siren was instantly severed, leaving the stairwell in dead silence. Bodirt checked his watch. He had wasted 10 minutes in the decoy bunker. He grabbed Dugan by the back of his coat and dragged him up the narrow concrete stairs. It was brutal, exhausting work. Dugan's head bounced against the steps. Bodirt didn't care. He hauled the dead weight up into the caretaker's cottage, out of the sterile underground air, and back into the humid, dusty decay. The storm was still tearing the roof apart outside. Rain lashed through the splintered front door. Bodirt dropped Dugan on the braided rug next to the open hatch. He pulled a pair of heavy zip ties from his jacket pocket, tools he carried specifically for moments when the law wasn't around to supply handcuffs. He cinched Dugan's wrists together behind his back, pulling the plastic tight enough to bite into the skin. He did the same to Dugan's ankles. The man wasn't going anywhere. Bodirt checked the magazine in his SIG. 14 rounds of hollow point left. 1 in the chamber. He slapped the magazine back in and holstered the weapon. He stepped out of the cottage and back into the hurricane. The wind nearly knocked him flat. The rain was a solid wall of water, blinding him instantly. He put his head down and pushed forward, leaving the dark cottage behind, aiming for the massive blacked-out silhouette of the main house. He moved through the cypress trees, his boots sinking deep into the flooded grass. As he closed the 70 yards, the details of Dugan's deception became obvious. 5 luxury SUVs were parked tight against the rear of the sprawling ranch house, their dark paint blending into the night. The house itself looked completely dead from the outside. But as Bodirt pressed his back against the wet stucco of the rear wall, he felt it. The concrete block was vibrating. It was a low, heavy bass rhythm, pulsing through the very foundation of the building. The hurricane was loud, but it couldn't completely drown out the sound system Dugan had installed inside. Bodirt moved along the wall, searching for an entry point. The back doors were heavy French glass, but they were shielded by motorized steel hurricane shutters pulled tight against the frames. There was no breaking through that without C4. He rounded the corner, moving toward the side of the house where Delia had parked her catering truck last week. A heavy commercial-grade steel door sat recessed in a narrow alcove. It was the service entrance, leading directly into the massive kitchen. The door didn't have a hurricane shutter. It didn't need one, but it did have a keypad lock. Bodirt stood in the pouring rain, staring at the glowing numbers. He reached out, wiping the water from the pad, and punched in the 4 digits Delia had given him for the main gate. 4491. The keypad flashed red. A sharp buzz rejected the code. Dugan didn't use the same code for his house that he gave to the vendors for the gate. Bodirt took a step back. He drew the SIG from his shoulder holster. He wasn't going to pick this lock. He didn't have the time, and he certainly didn't have the patience. He pressed the muzzle of the SIG directly against the glowing keypad, angling the barrel slightly downward to catch the internal locking mechanism. He pulled the trigger. The gunshot was deafening, a sharp crack of thunder that briefly outshouted the storm. The hollow point round obliterated the plastic casing, tearing through the circuit board and shattering the magnetic tumblers inside the heavy door. Sparks showered onto the wet concrete. Bodirt kicked the door hard, right next to the smoking hole. The deadbolt snapped. The heavy door swung inward. A blast of cold, conditioned air hit his face, carrying the smell of roasting meats, spilled champagne, and the heavy pulsing rhythm of electronic bass. Bodirt stepped over the threshold, raising the SIG, and walked into the party. Chapter 14. The heavy steel door swung shut behind him on its hydraulic hinge, abruptly decapitating the roar of the hurricane. The silence inside wasn't empty. It was filled with the frantic, high-end hum of a commercial catering operation running at full capacity. Bodirt stood in a massive, gleaming kitchen of stainless steel and white subway tile. The air was thick with the smell of seared beef, truffle oil, and citrus. 3 men in crisp white chef's coats stood around a central prep island. One was carefully placing microscopic sprigs of garnish onto a tray of scallops. He looked up, the stainless tweezers freezing in his hand. Bodirt was a waking nightmare, standing in their sterile workspace. Rainwater poured off his canvas jacket, pooling in black muddy puddles on the spotless tile. His knuckles were split and bleeding from where he had pistol-whipped Dugan. The Sig Sauer hung loose but ready in his right hand. The chef dropped the tweezers. They clattered sharply against the steel counter. Bodirt didn't raise the weapon. He put his left index finger to his lips in a universal gesture for silence, then walked straight past them. His heavy boots made a wet, squelching sound with every step. The kitchen staff flattened themselves against the walk-in refrigerators, holding their breath, absolutely unwilling to be the hero for an employer who wasn't even in the room. He pushed through the heavy wooden swinging doors at the far end of the kitchen. The electronic bass hit him immediately, a physical vibration thumping deep in his sternum. Dugan's open-concept ranch house was a cavernous monument to aggressive wealth. The vaulted ceilings were spanned by dark, exposed timber. The lighting was low and heavily curated. Amber washes and deep violet shadows designed to make everyone look 10 years younger and substantially more dangerous. There were at least 50 people in the room. They milled around a massive sunken living area and a custom marble bar that stretched 20 feet along the far wall. It was exactly the crowd Wade Crawley had described. Men in tailored linen suits and expensive watches. Women in sheer designer dresses, gripping flutes of champagne. They were tech executives, real estate developers, and hedge fund managers. People who had paid a fortune to step inside a fortress where the laws of the outside world were temporarily suspended. Bodirt stepped out of the shadows of the hallway and waded straight into the crowd. He didn't try to blend in. He didn't try to hide the gun. He moved with the slow, devastating momentum of a natural disaster. The music was too loud for anyone to hear him approach, but the visual shockwave radiated outward the second he hit the edge of the party. The laughter closest to him died instantly. A woman in a silver dress turned, saw the mud caked on his jeans and the black steel of the cig, and dropped her champagne glass. It shattered on the hardwood. The silence spread like a contagion. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. People stumbled backward, bumping into one another, creating a wide, terrified path through the center of the room. The only sound left was the relentless, pulsing thud of the electronic music pouring from the hidden speakers. Bodirt ignored the crowd. His eyes tracked through the ambient violet light, scanning the faces. He was looking for the aesthetic. The brown hair. The shy smile. He found her in the sunken conversation pit at the back of the room, positioned right against the blacked-out bay windows. Chloe Wembley sat wedged in the corner of a massive curved leather sectional. Someone had dressed her for the occasion. She wore a dark silk slip dress that hung awkwardly on her 14-year-old frame. Her face was painted with heavy, dramatic makeup meant to age her up, but it only made her look like a terrified child playing in her mother's closet. She sat perfectly rigid, her knees pressed tightly together. 2 men sat flanking her. They were older, in their late 50s, leaning in close, trapping her in the corner of the leather sofa. One of them had his hand resting casually on her bare shoulder. Bodirt stepped down into the sunken pit. The man with his hand on Chloe's shoulder looked up. He was heavily tanned, his eyes glassy and dilated from whatever designer chemical he had snorted in the bathroom 20 minutes earlier. He looked at Bodart's ruined clothes and the rainwater dripping onto the expensive Persian rug. He didn't register the gun hanging at Bodart's side. He only registered the insult to his environment. "Security," the tanned man barked, his voice slurred but arrogant. He looked past Bodirt toward the crowd. "Who let this garbage through the front door?" Bodirt didn't break stride. He closed the last 3 feet in a blur of motion. He brought his left hand up, grabbed the man by his expensive silk tie, and hauled him violently off the leather sofa. The man choked, his eyes going wide. Bodirt drove his right knee squarely into the man's ribs. Bone snapped with a sickening crunch that cut through the base. Bodirt tossed him aside like a bag of wet laundry. The man crashed into a glass coffee table, shattering it into 1,000 jagged pieces, and lay groaning on the floor. The second man on the sofa scrambled backward, scrambling over the back of the leather sectional to get away, his hands raised in pure panic. Bodirt stepped in front of Chloe. She looked up at him. The heavy makeup couldn't hide the absolute terror in her eyes. She pressed herself deep into the corner of the couch, pulling her knees up to her chest, shaking violently. She had spent 3 days locked in a concrete vault, and now a bleeding, mud-soaked stranger had just broken a man's ribs in front of her. Bodirt holstered the cig. He knelt down, putting himself at her eye level, ignoring the chaotic panic shouting erupting from the wealthy guests surrounding the pit. "Chloe," he said. His voice was calm, steady, projecting underneath the music. She flinched at her name. He reached into his soaked canvas jacket, pulled out the battered, water-damaged school photograph her mother had given him, and held it out. "My name is John," Bodirt said. "Your mother sent me. I watch Dateline too." Chloe stared at the photograph of herself. She looked at the school crest on the blazer, then slowly looked up at Bodart's bruised face. A ragged, desperate sob broke loose in her chest. The paralyzing shock finally shattered. She launched herself forward, throwing her thin arms around Bodart's neck, burying her face in his wet canvas jacket, crying so hard she was choking on the air. Bodirt put his arms around her, shielding her from the room. He looked up over her shoulder. The 50 wealthy guests had formed a wide, trembling circle around the sunken pit. None of them had cell phones out. None of them were dialing 911. Calling the police meant explaining exactly what they were doing at Harry Dugan's private residence on a Friday night. But Dugan didn't rely on the police. From the far hallway, 2 men pushed through the panicked crowd. They didn't wear linen suits. They wore dark tactical clothing, moving with the heavy, balanced coordination of private military contractors. Dugan had lied in the cottage. He didn't keep guards inside the bunker, but he absolutely kept muscle on the perimeter of the main house to manage his high-end clients. One of the men reached beneath his jacket. Bodirt wrapped his left arm tight around Chloe, pulling her securely against his side, and stood up. His right hand dropped to the cig. The party was over. Chapter 15. The man in the dark tactical jacket didn't shout a warning. He just cleared leather. Bodirt didn't give him the chance to level the weapon. He shoved Chloe flat onto the heavy leather sectional, brought the Sig Sauer up, and fired. Inside the cavernous, vaulted living room, the .45 caliber hollow point sounded like a mortar shell. The muzzle blast physically punched the air. The round caught the first contractor high in the right shoulder, spinning him violently into the custom marble bar. His weapon clattered across the polished floorboards, sliding into the shadows. The collective gasp of 50 wealthy guests turned into a single, unified scream. The stampede was instantaneous. The insulated, untouchable reality of Elysian estates shattered in less than a second. Hedge fund managers shoved women in sheer designer dresses out of the way, trampling each other in a frantic scramble for the front foyer. The second guard dropped to one knee, using the fleeing crowd as concealment, and returned fire. A bullet ripped through the leather cushion inches from Bodart's head and struck the blacked-out bay window behind the sofa. The heavy hurricane glass spider-webbed, then completely blew inward under the sheer crushing force of the storm outside. Wind and rain exploded into the sunken conversation pit, violently mixing with the pulsing electronic bass and the sharp, sulfuric smell of cordite. Bodart snapped his aim toward the muzzle flash. He squeezed the trigger twice in rapid succession. The second guard jerked backward, crashing into a lighted display case of ancient pottery. Glass and clay rained down over his motionless body. Bodart hauled Chloe off the couch by her arm. "Keep your head down. Look at my boots." They moved up out of the sunken pit, pushing into the churning chaos of the room. The amber lighting flickered and died, plunging the house into darkness before the emergency backups kicked in, strobing the room in harsh, panicked bursts of white light. Then Bodart saw him. Harry Dugan stood near the shattered front entrance. His charcoal raincoat was soaked in mud and his own blood. He held his hands in front of him, his wrists a brutal mess of deep lacerations. He had used the broken mirror glass from the bunker to saw straight through Bodart's heavy plastic zip ties, tearing his own skin to shreds in the process. Dugan didn't look like an architect of high-end fantasies anymore. He looked feral. He locked eyes with Bodart across the ruined room. Bodart raised the cig, centering the front sight on Dugan's chest. A surging wave of terrified partygoers rushed between them, physically blocking Bodart's line of sight. A man in a torn linen suit collided with Bodart's shoulder, screaming hysterically. By the time Bodart shoved the man aside and cleared his firing lane, the foyer was empty. Dugan had vanished into the hurricane. Bodart took a half-step forward, his jaw tight with the urge to pursue, but a small pair of hands dug desperately into his wet canvas jacket. He looked down. Chloe was trembling so hard her teeth were chattering, her dark slip dress completely soaked from the blown-out window. The priority wasn't the kill. It was the cargo. "We're leaving," Bodart said. He dragged her backward, retreating away from the main entrance, pushing through the heavy swinging doors into the commercial kitchen. The chefs were gone. The pristine stainless steel prep tables were abandoned, covered in half-finished hors d'oeuvres. They hit the shattered service door and spilled out into the torrential rain. The storm swallowed them whole. Bodart kept his body between the tree line and the girl, walking backward with the cig raised, expecting return fire from the darkness. Nothing came. Just the howling wind flattening the sugarcane fields. They reached the overgrown palmettos where the Ford sat hidden. Bodart threw open the passenger door. "Get in," he ordered. "Get down on the floorboard and cover your ears." Chloe scrambled inside. Bodart slammed the door, rounded the hood, and jumped behind the wheel. The engine caught with a rough, rattling roar that sounded beautiful in the chaos. He slammed the transmission into reverse, tearing backward out of the brush. The tires spun in the mud, caught traction on the limestone driveway, and launched the truck forward. The heavy steel gates were still locked open. Bodart aimed the rusted Ford straight through the concrete pillars and hit the county highway. The headlights cut a weak, yellow tunnel through the driving rain as he accelerated away from the compound. The cab of the truck was freezing. Chloe sat huddled on the floor mat, hugging her knees to her chest. Bodart reached over and cranked the heater to maximum. He kept his left hand on the steering wheel and pulled his cell phone from his pocket with his right. He wiped the screen on his jeans, pulled up Detective Rivas's number and hit call. She picked up on the first ring. "Bohannon," Rivas said. Her voice was sharp, tight with adrenaline. "I have the girl," Bodart shouted over the failing muffler and the drumming rain on the roof. "She's safe. But the cage is open. Shots fired at the property. Mr. Goodtime is in the wind." "Where are you?" "Heading east, on the agricultural highway. Meet me at the county line. I'm scrambling tactical units to the house right now, Rivas said, the sound of a siren already winding up in the background of her call. Keep driving, John. Don't stop for anything. Bodirt dropped the phone onto the passenger seat. He stared through the sweeping windshield wipers into the black storm. He had saved the girl, but he had looked Dugan in the eye and watched the man slip away. The hunt wasn't over. It had just escalated. Chapter 16. The rusted Ford limped onto the cracked concrete apron of an abandoned commercial way station on the county line. The hurricane had officially downgraded to a tropical storm as it dragged its center across the peninsula, but the rain still fell in heavy, punishing sheets. A single unmarked police cruiser sat idling beneath the station's rusted corrugated canopy. Its light bar strobed red and blue, painting the wet concrete in violent flashing colors. Bodirt pulled the Ford beneath the canopy, cut the headlights, and threw the transmission into park. The truck's engine rattled, coughed twice, and died. The sudden absence of the failing muffler made the drumming rain on the metal roof sound deafening. He looked at the passenger seat. Chloe Wembley sat curled into a tight ball, her knees pulled to her chest, shivering despite the cab heater blasting at full capacity. She stared blankly through the windshield at the flashing police lights. The back door of the unmarked cruiser flew open. Patricia Wembley stepped out into the storm. She didn't have an umbrella. She didn't wear a raincoat. She wore a heavy wool sweater pulled tight over her silk blouse, her dark hair instantly plastered to her skull by the driving rain. She ran across the flooded concrete toward the Ford, her expensive shoes slipping in the oily puddles. Bodirt reached across the cab and popped the passenger door. Patricia caught the handle and hauled the door open. She didn't say a word. She lunged into the cab, wrapped her arms around her daughter, and buried her face in Chloe's wet, matted hair. A ragged, guttural sob ripped out of her chest. It was a raw, primal sound that completely cut through the noise of the storm. Chloe finally unspooled. She threw her arms around her mother's neck, weeping into the soaked wool sweater. Bodirt watched them for a few seconds. He didn't feel relief. The adrenaline was still burning hot in his blood, demanding a target that was no longer in the room. He reached over, grabbed the interior door handle, and pulled the passenger door shut, leaving the mother and daughter alone in the warm cab. He pushed his own door open and stepped out into the weather. Detective Isabella Rivas stood leaning against the front quarter panel of her cruiser. She wore a heavy yellow slicker, her arms crossed tight over her chest. The strobe lights cast harsh, shifting shadows across her angular face. She watched Bodirt approach, taking in the mud caked to his jeans, the canvas jacket soaked completely black, and the fresh blood slowly washing off his split knuckles. "The EMTs are 3 minutes out," Rivas said, raising her voice over the rain. "I held them back until you secured the perimeter. I didn't want lights and sirens spooking the suspect." "The suspect is already spooked," Bodirt said. He leaned his back against the cold steel of the cruiser, wincing as the bruised bones in his foot protested the weight. He used the panic in the main house to slip out the front door. "I know." Rivas uncrossed her arms and pulled a heavily encrypted tactical radio from her belt. "My SRT units breached the gates 10 minutes after you called. They went in heavy. They found 50 of the wealthiest people in Palm Beach County screaming for their lawyers, a shattered conversation pit, and 2 private military contractors bleeding on the floorboards. They'll live. One of them took a hollow point through the collarbone. He's in a medically induced coma. The other has a shattered kneecap." Rivas clipped the radio back to her belt. She didn't sound angry. She sounded strictly professional. "They found the sub-basement under the cottage, John. They found the vault door. Crime scene tech is prying it open right now. Then you have your probable cause." I have a mountain of it. Ravis looked past him, toward the Ford where Patricia Wembley was slowly coaxing her daughter out of the cab. I have the bunker. I have the photographs from the storage unit. I have a 14-year-old victim who can place him inside that locked room. The warrants are being typed up as we stand here. Harry Dugan is officially the most wanted man in the state of Florida. And he's already gone. Ravis turned her sharp gaze back to Bodirt. We locked down the airports. Highway Patrol has the interstates choked with checkpoints. We have his face blinking on every terminal, from Miami to Jacksonville. He can't run. He doesn't run on interstates, Bodirt said flatly. He doesn't fly commercial. He's a ghost with an unlimited bank account. While your guys were cordoning off his driveway and bagging my brass casings, Dugan was already initiating an exit strategy he probably built 5 years ago. He has a private plane or a boat, and he has the cash to make the pilots forget his name. The wail of an ambulance siren cut through the dark, approaching fast from the east. I have federal task forces spinning up, Ravis countered, though the absolute certainty in her voice was cracking. The FBI is taking lead on the interstate flight warrants. His assets will be frozen by morning. You can't freeze cash in a duffel bag. Bodirt pushed off the cruiser. The movement sent a sharp spike of pain up his leg, but he ignored it. You sit at your desk, and you coordinate your task forces, detective. You did your job. The girl is out. Ravis stepped into his path, blocking him from the truck. Her dark eyes were perfectly level with his. The job is done for you too, she said. Her voice dropped, taking on a hard, authoritative edge. You went off the leash. You fired a weapon inside a crowded room. You broke a man's ribs. I can cover for you, because you delivered the victim alive, and you handed me the legal leverage I needed to break this case wide open. But the immunity ends right here on this concrete. The ambulance roared into the way station, its headlights blinding them briefly as it swung around the Ford and parked. 2 paramedics jumped out, carrying heavy trauma bags, rushing toward Patricia and Chloe. Go home, John, Ravis ordered. Ice your hands. Drink whatever cheap whiskey you keep in that trailer. Tomorrow morning, you walk into my precinct and you give a sanitized, highly redacted statement for the official record. And you leave Harry Dugan to the state. Bodirt looked at her. He saw the genuine concern, mixed with the rigid institutional boundaries she couldn't cross. She believed the system would work now that it was fully engaged. She had to believe it, or else wearing the badge was pointless. I'll see you tomorrow, detective, Bodirt said. He stepped around her, walking back to the Ford. The paramedics had guided Chloe into the back of the ambulance. Patricia Wembley stood in the rain by the open doors, watching Bodirt approach. She reached into her soaked wool sweater and pulled out a thick envelope. She held it out to him. It was dripping wet, the paper disintegrating. The rest of your fee, Patricia said, her voice hoarse and raw. It's all there. Plus a bonus. I don't care about the money. Just take it. Bodirt didn't reach for the envelope. Keep it. Use it for the therapy she's going to need. Use it to pay the lawyers when Dugan's legal team tries to drag her through a deposition. You brought her back. I brought her back, Bodirt agreed. He climbed into the cab of the Ford. He pulled the heavy door shut, sealing out the noise of the ambulance radio and the flashing lights. He shifted the truck into gear, the transmission grinding heavily in protest. He pulled out from under the corrugated canopy, leaving the way station behind, merging back onto the slick, dark asphalt of the county highway. He drove west, away from the coast, away from his airstream. Ravis was wrong. The job wasn't done. The girl was safe, but the architect was still breathing. If Dugan escaped the country, he would simply rebuild his collection in a place where Palm Beach warrants meant absolutely nothing. He would find another storage unit. He would buy another velvet chair. He would find another girl with a shy smile who hadn't yet learned that monsters wore expensive suits. Bodirt reached into his jacket pocket with his left hand. He pulled out the cheap disposable camera he had used at the storage unit and tossed it onto the passenger seat. He wasn't going to give a sanitized statement in the morning. He was going to find out how a millionaire vanished in the middle of a hurricane. And there was only one man in the county who knew the exact logistics of moving high-value contraband out of South Florida under the radar. Bodirt pressed his boot down on the accelerator. The Ford tore through the standing water, headed straight for Wade Crawley's ranch. Chapter 17. The hurricane tore itself apart over the center of the state, bleeding out into a heavy, relentless tropical depression. The wind lost its violent edge, but the sheer volume of water left behind transformed the Everglades agricultural area into a sprawling, shallow lake. Bodirt drove the Ford through flooded intersections, the rusted floorboards leaking brown water into the cab. Dawn was trying to break through the cloud cover, turning the eastern horizon the color of old lead. He reached the wrought iron gates of Wade Crawley's ranch an hour after sunrise. The decorative spheres had survived, but a massive oak branch lay directly across the driveway, blocking the entrance. Bodirt didn't bother getting out to move it. He shifted the Ford into four-wheel drive, the transmission grinding in heavy protest, and drove the truck straight over the manicured swale, bypassing the gate entirely. The ranch had taken a beating. Spanish moss littered the flooded lawns like wet gray netting. The Capuchin monkeys were nowhere to be seen, likely locked safely inside a climate-controlled sanctuary while the rest of the county drowned. Bodirt parked near the main house, killed the engine, and stepped out. Every muscle in his body felt like it had been beaten with a tire iron. His boots were heavy with mud, and the canvas jacket clung to his shoulders like a weighted blanket. He didn't knock on the heavy front door. He walked around the side of the Spanish Revival house, heading straight for the stables. He found Crawley inside the massive, pristine barn. The air smelled of clean hay, sweet feed, and expensive leather. Crawley wore rubber muck boots and a heavy yellow slicker, calmly running a brush over the flank of a massive chestnut thoroughbred. He didn't look up when Bodirt's boots echoed on the concrete center aisle. "You look like a drowned rat, John," Crawley said, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. "And judging by the fact that you're tracking mud into my barn at 6 in the morning, I assume the party didn't go well." "The party got shut down," Bodirt said. He stopped outside the stall, leaning his weight against the heavy wooden gate. "I found the girl. Handed her over to the county an hour ago. SRT raided the property. They found the vault." Crawley stopped brushing. He rested his heavy, calloused hand on the horse's back and finally turned around. His pale blue eyes tracked over Bodirt's split knuckles, the dark blood staining the cuff of his shirt, and the sheer hollow exhaustion in his face. "If the county raided the property, then Dugan is in custody, and you should be sleeping." Dugan slipped the net. He used the panic in the main house to get out the front door. The interstates are locked down, the airports are crawling with federal agents, and his assets are going to be frozen by noon. Crawley let out a rough, barking laugh. "You think a man like Harry Dugan cares about federal asset freezes? You think he keeps his operational capital in a Bank of America checking account?" "I think he has an exit strategy," Bodirt said. "And I think he's executing it right now. The cops are looking for him on the highways. He's not on the highways. He's moving through the cracks. You know the cracks, Wade. Tell me how he leaves the state." Crawley stepped out of the stall and slid the heavy iron latch shut. He walked over to a tack trunk, opened it, and pulled out 2 clean towels. He tossed one to Bodirt. Bodirt caught it and wiped the rainwater and grime off his face. "A man with Dugan's resources doesn't run," Crawley explained, leaning against the wooden trunk. "He evaporates. He already has a go bag packed with bearer bonds, uncut stones, or sequentially unmarked hundreds. He has a secondary passport that will pass a biometric scan in any non-extradition country on the map. All he needs is the transportation to bridge the gap between South Florida and international airspace. Who flies in this weather? A smuggler who owes a massive debt, or a pilot getting paid enough to retire tomorrow." Crawley crossed his arms, staring out the open barn doors at the flooded paddocks. "The private airstrips are too risky. The feds will be watching the radar feeds out of Opelika and Fort Lauderdale Executive. If Dugan is leaving today, he's leaving off the grid. He's taking a waterbird." "A seaplane." "An amphibious twin-engine," Crawley corrected. "Flies beneath the radar floor, lands on the open ocean, and refuels in the Bahamas before skipping down to South America. There are only a handful of pilots left in this state, crazy enough to run those routes in the wake of a hurricane." "Give me a name." Crawley hesitated. The silence in the barn was absolute, broken only by the soft rhythmic breathing of the thoroughbreds. The ex-smuggler was calculating the risk of exposing his own network. "Marcus Vance," Crawley finally said. "He flies an old Grumman Mallard. Modified fuel tanks, stripped interior. He usually runs untaxed pharmaceuticals out of the islands, but for the right price, he'll haul high-value fugitives. Vance doesn't operate out of a marina. Too many Coast Guard patrols. He uses the lake. Okeechobee is massive." "Where on the lake?" "I don't track his daily flight logs, John. I just know his name." Crawley pointed a thick finger at Bodart's chest. "You're bleeding. You're exhausted. And you're operating completely outside the law now. You catch Dugan on that dock, you aren't making an arrest. You're committing a homicide. I'm finishing the job." Bodart tossed the damp towel onto the tack trunk, turned, and walked back out into the gray morning. He climbed into the fort, his wet clothes freezing in the chill air. He pulled his cell phone from his pocket. The battery was sitting at 12%. He dialed the number for the Pink Flamingo Motel and hit the speaker button, dropping the phone onto the passenger seat next to the cheap disposable camera. Serena picked up on the third ring. "I charge double for readings before noon," she said. Her voice was husky, thick with sleep and cigarettes. "I don't need a reading. I need eyes on the street." Bodart put the truck in gear and splashed back across Crawley's flooded lawn, aiming for the highway. "I need to locate a smuggler named Marcus Vance. He flies an amphibious plane out of Lake Okeechobee. Harry Dugan is paying him to leave the country this morning." The line was quiet for a moment. Bodart could hear the faint click of a lighter and a long exhale of smoke. "The police scanners are losing their minds, John," Serena said softly. "They're talking about a bunker. They're talking about a high society raid. You kicked over the whole table." "Did you get the name?" "Marcus Vance." "I know Vance. The girls who work the sugarcane towns buy from him when he flies back from the islands." Papers rustled in the background. "He uses an abandoned sugar company loading ramp on the southeast rim of the lake, near Belglade. It's totally overgrown, completely hidden from the levee road." "Is he there right now?" "Give me 2 minutes." The line went dead. Bodart merged onto the highway, pointing the heavy grill of the Ford west toward the interior of the state, straight toward the massive dark expanse of Lake Okeechobee. The rain was finally stopping, replaced by a thick, suffocating ground fog rising off the flooded fields. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat. He snatched it up. "He's there," Serena confirmed. "One of my girls just drove past the levee. She saw Vance's truck parked near the tree line." The plane is in the water, tied to the old concrete ramp. They're loading fuel. Did she see Dugan? She saw a man in a dark coat, carrying a heavy duffel bag, walking down to the dock. He looked like he was in a hurry. Serena's voice dropped, shedding the psychic persona completely. Listen to me, John. Vance carries a rifle in his truck, and Dugan is a cornered animal. You walk down that ramp, they aren't going to ask to see your badge. They're going to put you in the water. I don't carry a badge anymore. Bodirt killed the call and tossed the phone onto the dashboard. The sky above the glades was finally turning a pale, washed-out blue. The storm had washed the world clean, but it had left the monsters exposed in the daylight. Bodirt checked the cig in his shoulder holster, feeling the reassuring weight of the cold steel against his ribs. He pressed the accelerator to the floor. The Ford's engine roared, eating up the miles of flat, wet asphalt. He was 30 minutes away from Belle Glade, 30 minutes away from the edge of the lake, and 30 minutes away from Harry Dugan. Chapter 18. The Herbert Hoover Dike stood 30 feet high, a massive earthen wall built to keep Lake Okeechobee from swallowing the southern half of the state. Driving along the base of the levee, the world felt aggressively flat and completely empty. The hurricane had stripped the sugarcane fields down to ragged green stumps. Ground fog clung to the flooded irrigation canals like greasy wool, burning off slowly under the pale morning sun. Bodirt kept the Ford speedometer pinned at 60, the heavy tires throwing fans of muddy water into the sawgrass. 2 miles south of Belle Glade, the paved road ended, turning into a deeply rutted limestone track that ran straight up the side of the dike. Bodirt downshifted. The truck clawed its way to the top of the embankment. The lake stretched out on the other side, an inland sea the color of dark tea, churning with whitecaps whipped up by the dying storm. Bodirt drove a quarter-mile along the top of the levee until he spotted the break in the tree line. An overgrown access road plunged back down toward the water, terminating at a crumbling concrete loading ramp that hadn't seen commercial use since the 1970s. A rusted Dodge Ram pickup sat parked near the tree line, its tailgate dropped. 30 yards beyond the truck, bobbing heavily in the dark water, was a vintage Grumman Mallard. The amphibious twin-engine plane was painted a flat, non-reflective gray. The side cargo door was open. Bodirt eased the Ford off the levee road, parking it out of sight behind a thick stand of Brazilian pepper trees. He killed the engine. The silence of the glades rushed back in, broken only by the lapping of the lake against the concrete and the low, mechanical whine of a portable aviation fuel pump. He drew the Sig Sauer, checked the chamber one last time, and stepped out of the truck. He moved downhill through the wet, waist-high sawgrass, keeping his profile low, his boots sinking into the saturated earth. The wind coming off the lake was cold, carrying the sharp scent of aviation fuel and dead fish. As Bodirt cleared the tree line, he had a clean, unobstructed view of the ramp. A man in a grease-stained mechanic's jumpsuit stood on the plane's pontoon, holding a heavy black hose connected to the wing tank. Marcus Vance. He was lean, deeply tanned, and moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who needed to put miles between himself and the coastline before the Coast Guard launched their morning patrols. Harry Dugan stood on the cracked concrete dock. The untouchable architect of Elysian Estates looked utterly destroyed. His charcoal raincoat was gone, abandoned somewhere between his fortified compound and the lake. He wore a torn, blood-stained white dress shirt. His silver hair was plastered to his forehead. His hands were clumsily wrapped in strips of torn fabric, the makeshift bandages soaking through with dark, fresh blood from the lacerations he'd suffered, sawing through Bodirt's zip ties. Dugan had a heavy leather duffel bag slung across his chest, gripping the thick strap like it was a life preserver. He paced nervously, his expensive shoes sliding on the slick, algae-covered concrete, looking over his shoulder toward the levee every 10 seconds. "Pump it faster," Dugan barked, his voice raw and cracking. "We're wasting time." She drinks what she drinks, Vance replied calmly, not bothering to look up from the fuel gauge. You push the pressure, you blow a line, and we both sit here until the cops show up. Relax. The radar is clear. Bodirt stepped out of the sawgrass. He didn't shout. He didn't announce himself. He just walked down the center of the crushed limestone path, the heavy cig leveled squarely at Vance's chest. Vance saw him first. The smuggler's eyes widened slightly. He recognized the aggressive geometry of a man holding a weapon with lethal intent. Vance's hand drifted slowly away from the fuel nozzle, dropping toward the open tailgate of the Dodge Ram where the stock of a hunting rifle protruded from a canvas bag. Don't do it, Marcus, Bodirt said. His voice carried cleanly over the slap of the water. Vance froze. He looked at Bodirt's bruised face, the mud-soaked canvas jacket, and the absolute lack of hesitation in his eyes. He looked at Dugan. Then he looked back at the gun. You ain't wearing a badge, Vance noted. I'm not here to arrest you. I'm just here for your passenger. Bodirt closed the distance, stopping 15 feet away from the edge of the concrete ramp. Step away from the truck. Put your hands on the side of the fuselage. Dugan spun around at the sound of Bodirt's voice. The color completely drained from his face. He stumbled backward, his heel catching on a rusted mooring cleat, and nearly fell into the murky water. He caught himself, his ruined hands wrapping desperately around the leather strap of the duffel bag. Shoot him! Dugan screamed, turning to Vance. There's an extra 100,000 in the bag. 200. Pick up the rifle and shoot him. Vance didn't move toward the truck. He carefully unlatched the heavy brass fuel nozzle, set it gently on the pontoon, and raised his hands to shoulder height. He was a professional. He measured risk in fuel weight and radar signatures, and the math standing in front of him simply didn't add up to survival. 200,000 doesn't stitch a bullet hole, friend, Vance said to Dugan. I haul cargo. I don't fight wars. Vance stepped off the pontoon onto the concrete, keeping his hands visible. He didn't look at Dugan again. He looked straight at Bodirt. The pump is off. The plane is yours. I'm going to walk up that levee and disappear into the cane. We don't have a problem here. Bodirt gave him a single, tight nod. Walk. Vance moved sideways, giving Bodirt a wide berth, his boots crunching on the limestone. He didn't break into a run until he hit the tree line, vanishing into the heavy morning fog without a backward glance. Bodirt and Dugan were alone on the crumbling dock. The portable fuel pump sputtered and died, plunging the loading ramp into an eerie, isolating silence. The Grumman Mallard bobbed gently against its mooring lines. The dark water of Lake Okeechobee slapped the concrete. Dugan stood at the edge of the ramp. He was trapped. There was nowhere left to run. No private security to step between them. No panicked party guests to use as a shield. Just the muddy water behind him, and the cold steel of the Sig Sauer pointed at his chest. Bodirt walked forward, his boots heavy on the wet concrete. Dugan held the leather duffel bag up like a shield. His breathing was rapid and shallow, a sharp, panicked wheeze. You can have it, Dugan gasped, his voice vibrating with absolute desperation. He fumbled with the heavy brass zipper, his bandaged hands slipping on the wet metal. He managed to rip it open, exposing thick, banded stacks of sequentially unmarked $100 bills. There's $5 million in this bag. Untraceable. It's yours. Take the truck, take the cash, walk away. Bodirt didn't stop. He kept walking until he was less than 3 feet away. 5 million, Dugan repeated, his eyes darting frantically from Bodirt's face to the gun. You live in a trailer. You drive a rusted piece of garbage. You can disappear. You can buy a new life anywhere in the world. Just let me get on that plane. Bodirt stared at the thick stacks of cash. He thought about the Airstream. He thought about the transmission slipping in second gear. He thought about the heavy, suffocating weight of being perpetually broke and angry. Then he looked at Dugan's face. He didn't see a billionaire offering him a way out. He saw a pathetic, bleeding animal who genuinely believed that every single thing in the world, including human life, had a purchase price. He saw the empty space inside the man that Delia had warned him about. Bodirt raised his left hand and slapped the heavy leather duffel bag hard. The bag flew out of Dugan's ruined grip. It hit the slick concrete, sliding sideways, and pitched over the edge of the dock. It hit the dark water with a heavy splash, immediately sinking beneath the murky surface, dragging $5 million down into the lake bed. Dugan stared at the ripples in the water, his jaw slack, his mind completely unable to process what had just happened. Bodirt stepped into Dugan's personal space and pressed the hot muzzle of the Sig Sauer directly against the center of the man's white dress shirt. "I don't want your money," Bodirt whispered. Chapter 19. The heavy leather duffel bag breached the surface of Lake Okeechobee one last time, burped a dark bubble of trapped air, and vanished permanently into the silt. Harry Dugan stared at the expanding rings of water. The fundamental mathematics of his universe had just been violently rewritten. He had spent his entire adult life operating on a single, unwavering principle. Every lock had a key, and every man had a price. He looked away from the water and stared down at the black steel of the Sig Sauer pressed hard against his sternum. He finally looked up into Bodirt's eyes. "You're a fool," Dugan whispered, his voice shaking, the polished veneer cracking to reveal the raw, terrified arrogance underneath. "You think handing me over to a county detective changes anything? You think a public defender is going to walk me into a courtroom and I'll just quietly accept a life sentence?" Bodirt didn't move the gun. He didn't speak. He let the silence stretch, letting the cold reality of the concrete dock press in on Dugan. Dugan swallowed hard. His manic energy shifted, desperately seeking a new angle of leverage. If he couldn't buy the man, he had to infect him. "I know exactly how the system works, John," Dugan said, leaning slightly into the barrel of the gun, his voice dropping into that dark, gravitational hum. "I have a legal team sitting in high-rise offices in Miami who bill $1,000 an hour. They will bury Isabella Rivas in procedural motions. They'll claim the search of the bunker was illegal. They'll claim the storage unit was rented by a shell company I have no connection to. They will put Chloe Wembley on a witness stand and tear that poor girl's trauma into tiny, unrecognizable shreds." Bodirt's finger tightened on the trigger. The pressure required to drop the hammer was suddenly infinitesimally small. "You know I'm right," Dugan pressed, sensing the hesitation. "You used to wear the badge. You lost your career because you figured out the rules only protect the monsters. If you put me in the back of a police cruiser today, I will be out on bail by Tuesday. And the second I walk out of that courthouse, I am going to vanish. You will never see me again. But you will know exactly what I'm doing." Dugan smiled. It was a ghastly, blood-flecked thing. "I will start over. I will build a new room. I will find another girl with a shy smile. And every time you close your eyes in that aluminum trailer, you will see her face, knowing you had the chance to stop it right here on this dock." The wind off the lake whipped Bodirt's canvas jacket against his sides. The smell of aviation fuel was thick and nauseating. Dugan was absolutely right. The justice system was a porous, bureaucratic machine designed to be navigated by men with infinite capital. There was a highly probable timeline where Dugan walked. The rage Bodirt had been suppressing for years flared hot and bright in his chest. It tasted like copper. It was the exact same rage that had caused him to beat a suspect half to death in a Winn-Dixie parking lot. It was the wrecking ball. The urge to pull the trigger, watch Dugan's chest cave in, and kick his body into the dark water to rot with his $5 million was overwhelming. Bodirt cocked the hammer of the cig. The mechanical clack was loud against the slap of the water. Dugan's smile vanished. The reality of his own argument suddenly crashed down on him. He had successfully convinced Bodirt that the law wouldn't work, which left Bodirt with only one logical alternative. "Wait," Dugan choked out, raising his ruined bandaged hands. "Wait." Bodirt stared at the man. He saw the 9 Polaroids hanging in the freezing storage unit. He saw Chloe Wembley huddled on the floorboard of his truck, shivering violently in an oversized slip dress. Then he heard Marta's voice, cutting through the roar in his ears like a foghorn. "Are you going to be the detective who saves her life, or are you going to be the wrecking ball that destroys everything in the room to satisfy an itch?" Shooting Dugan wasn't justice. It was surrender. It was agreeing with Dugan's worldview that everyone was just a violent animal operating outside the rules. If he pulled the trigger, Dugan died, but the man Bodirt used to be, the tracker, the protector, the husband, died right alongside him on the wet concrete. Bodirt slowly, deliberately, decocked the cig. He didn't lower the weapon. He suddenly drove the heavy steel frame of the gun upward, catching Dugan flush under the jaw. Dugan's teeth snapped together with a sickening crack. His eyes rolled back in his head. He collapsed instantly, hitting the concrete ramp hard, completely unconscious before his shoulders struck the ground. Bodirt stood over him, his chest heaving, the adrenaline slowly bleeding out of his system. The storm was over. He holstered the cig. He walked over to the Grumman Mallard, grabbed a length of heavy nylon mooring rope coiled on the pontoon, and pulled a knife from his pocket. He cut 2 thick sections of rope. He walked back to Dugan, rolled the unconscious man onto his stomach, and bound his wrists and ankles with brutal, inescapable knots. He dragged Dugan up the crushed limestone path, the billionaire's expensive shoes scraping against the rocks, and hauled him to the ford. Bodirt dropped the tailgate, grabbed Dugan by the belt and the collar, and heaved him into the rusted bed of the truck like a sack of wet feed. He slammed the tailgate shut. He opened the driver's side door, climbed into the cab, and picked up his cell phone from the dashboard. He plugged it into the 12-volt charger. The screen flickered to life, showing 11% battery. He dialed Detective Rivas. She answered immediately, the background noise of a chaotic precinct command center echoing through the speaker. "Tell me you didn't do something stupid, John." "The airstrips were a decoy," Bodirt said, his voice flat and exhausted. "He was trying to take a water bird out of Okeechobee." "Where is he?" "He missed his flight." Bodirt put the truck in gear and pulled away from the tree line, leaving the Grumman Mallard bobbing uselessly at the abandoned dock. "I'm heading east on the Levee Road, toward Belglade. Send a transport van. He's tied up in the bed of my truck, and he's going to need a dentist before you book him." The line went dead silent for 3 long seconds. When Rivas spoke again, the institutional rigidity was gone. There was only profound, unvarnished relief. "I have a cruiser 5 miles from your location," Rivas said quietly. "Pull over when you see the lights. I'll meet you at the precinct." "I'm not coming to the precinct, Detective. You have your suspect. You have your bunker. You don't need my redacted statement to put him away." "John, I broke the law to find him. You look the other way, and we call it square. You take the win, Isabella. Make it stick." Bodirt hung up the phone and tossed it onto the passenger seat. He drove the rusted Ford along the top of the Herbert Hoover Dike. The sun finally broke through the heavy cloud cover, casting brilliant, blinding shafts of light across the sprawling surface of the lake. Harry Dugan groaned in the bed of the truck, waking up to a world he could no longer buy his way out of. Bodirt didn't look in the rearview mirror. He just pressed his foot down on the accelerator, driving away from the water and heading back toward the coast. He had a few final things to bury before he could finally go home. Chapter 20. A Palm Beach County Sheriff's cruiser sat on the shoulder of State Road 80, its light bar painting the flooded sawgrass red and blue. Bodirt pulled the rusted Ford over behind it. He left the engine running, shifted into park, and stared straight ahead through the water-spotted windshield. Two uniformed deputies stepped out of the cruiser. They didn't approach his window. They walked directly to the back of the truck, dropped the tailgate, and hauled a groaning, bleeding Harry Dugan out of the bed. Bodirt didn't look in the rearview mirror. He didn't wait to see them read Dugan his rights or load him into the caged backseat. He just pulled the gear shift down and merged back onto the empty highway. The transaction was complete. Rivas had her monster, and Bodirt had his soul. He drove east, chasing the morning sun as it burned away the last of the heavy cloud cover. The storm had completely broken. The sky was an impossible, bruised blue, swept clean of the oppressive humidity that had choked the coast for a week. When he finally reached the dirt track leading to his lot, the airstream was exactly where he'd left it. It sat anchored to the gray concrete slab, gleaming dull silver in the harsh light. The county zoning violation still hung framed in the window. Bodirt cut the engine. He sat in the cab for a long minute, letting the absolute silence of the scrub oak and sand wash over him. The weather radio wasn't chattering. The wind was dead. He climbed out of the truck, his boots sinking into the saturated earth. His canvas jacket was stiff with dried mud and lake water. He stripped it off, tossed it onto the passenger seat over the cheap disposable camera, and shut the door. He walked inside the airstream. The air was stifling, smelling of stale coffee and gun oil. He walked to the fold-down table. The stack of glossy photographs Detective Rivas had left behind sat perfectly undisturbed. Sarah Keene. Maria Santos. The others. 9 faces staring up at the low aluminum ceiling. Bodirt gathered the photographs, his bruised fingers stiff and aching. He didn't look at the names Rivas had scrawled on the back. He already knew them. He carried the stack outside. The concrete was wet, the weeds bent flat from the wind, the sand dark and heavy with rain. He walked to the far edge of the slab, to the exact spot where Marta's front porch used to sit before the hurricane scraped the lot clean, and knelt down. He used his bare hands to dig into the wet earth. The sand was cold and packed tight. He dug until he hit the porous limestone shelf a foot below the surface. The photographs went into the trench one by one. Sarah Keene. Maria Santos. 9 faces. 9 women who had been taken, kept, and hidden in a room with no windows by a man who thought he could buy the world. Bodirt covered them with the wet sand. He pressed the earth down flat with his palms, packing it tight, letting the groundwater seep up into the paper, letting the images blur and dissolve into the Florida dirt. It wasn't a courtroom conviction. It wasn't a headline. But it was a burial. The ledger was finally clean. He stood up, wiped the sand from his hands onto his jeans, and walked back to the Ford. He didn't look back at the airstream or the patch of disturbed earth. He opened the driver's door and climbed in. He turned the key. The engine started on the first try, catching with a smooth, steady rumble he hadn't heard in months. He shifted into gear. The transmission didn't slip. It engaged with a solid, mechanical thud. He pulled out of the empty lot, steering the heavy grill onto the dirt track, and merged onto the paved road heading east toward the Intracoastal. The sun was fully up now, baking the asphalt, the heat already building inside the cab. He drove with the windows down, letting the salt air rush in, carrying the scent of blooming mangroves and open water. He was driving toward the wooden dock where Marta would be untying her kayaks. Toward the woman who had told him to find his way back. He pressed his boot against the accelerator. The Ford held its rhythm. The road stretched out perfectly straight, the sky wide and glaring, the morning burning rapidly toward noon. The day opened up ahead of him, bright and vast, like something that had just been waiting for him to arrive. The end. Did you get your copy of Tulsa Time?